Tonight, before anything else, I want you to picture a single rider on a long straight road, in the last blue hour of the evening, somewhere in the high open country of what we now call Iran, a very long time ago. The road runs out ahead of him toward the mountains, pale and dusty and perfectly kept, and it runs out behind him toward the sea, and it does not stop, in either direction, for more than 1,600 miles. The air is thin and cool up here on the plateau, and it smells of dust and crushed thyme and the far-off cold of the snow that never quite leaves the highest peaks, and the sky above the rider is enormous, deepening from gold in the west to a soft violet overhead, with the first few stars coming out one by one, unhurried, the way stars do. The rider is a young man in a felt cap and a coat of soft leather, and he sits his horse easily, the way a man sits who has been riding since before he could walk, and in a satchel against his ribs he carries a letter, sealed in clay, stamped with the mark of a king. He does not know what the letter says. It is not his business to know. His business is the road, and the next station of the road, which he will reach a little after dark, where there will be a fire, and hot food, and a fresh horse standing saddled and waiting, and a fresh rider if he is too tired to go on, because the letter does not rest, even when men do. The letter has come down from the cold mountains where the king spends his summers, and it is going to the warm river country where the king spends his winters, and between those two places lie deserts and passes and bridges and fords, and 100 stations like the one ahead, each with its fire and its fresh horses, so that a message can cross the whole width of the greatest empire the world has ever seen in a single week, in an age when most people on earth will never in their whole lives travel further than the next valley. Nothing moves faster than these riders, it is said, not even the cranes flying south, and neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor the darkness of night keeps them from finishing, as quickly as they can, the stage of the journey that has been given to them. The rider crests a low rise, and for a moment he can see the whole world laid out in the failing light, the road dropping away before him in a pale thread, a village here and there with its small warm lamps just being lit, the darkening fields, the silver ghost of a river, the mountains standing black against the last of the sunset, and beyond all of that, invisible but absolutely real. The rest of it, the whole impossible sweep of it, provinces and peoples without number, speaking 100 languages, worshipping 1,000 gods, herdsmen on the cold northern steppe and fishermen on warm southern seas, brickmakers in Babylon and goldsmiths in Lydia and scribes in Egypt, bent over their papyrus in the lamplight, all of them, tonight, living inside one single enormous piece, under one single distant king, connected by nothing more than roads like this one, and riders like him, and letters like the one against his ribs. He does not think about this, any more than a fish thinks about the sea. He clicks his tongue, and the horse picks up its pace, and horse and rider go down the long slope into the blue evening, getting smaller and smaller, until they are only a moving speck on a pale thread of road, and then nothing at all, and the land is still again beneath the coming night. That is where we are going tonight. We are going to Persia. Not to one battle, or one king, or one famous ruin, but across the whole long life of a people who began as wandering herdsmen on the edge of other men's empires, and who rose, in the span of a single lifetime, to rule very nearly the entire world that was known to them, from the islands of Greece to the borders of India, the first empire of its kind that the earth had ever carried, and in some ways the mould from which every empire since has been cast. We will follow them up out of the mountains and into the light of history, through the reigns of kings whose names still ring like struck bronze, Cyrus and Darius and Xerxes, through the building of roads and palaces and gardens so lovely that our own word paradise is simply the old Persian word for one of them, through wars and wonders and long golden afternoons of peace, and then down the far slope of the story, gently into twilight, when a young man from Macedonia came east with an army and the whole vast structure folded up in a handful of years, and the palaces burned, and the story seemed to end, except that stories like this one never quite end. And we will see at the very last how much of that ancient world is still quietly alive inside our own. It is a very long story, and there is no hurry at all. We have the whole night ahead of us, and the story will unroll as slowly and as evenly as that long straight road, and you do not need to remember any of it. Not one name, not one date, because this is not a lesson, it is a journey, and the only thing you need to do on this journey is grow more and more comfortable, and more still, and let yourself be carried. So settle now into whatever stillness you have made for yourself. Let the bed take the whole weight of you, your head, your shoulders, your arms, your hands, and notice how good it is simply to stop. At the end of a long day, the way the rider stops at last at the fire and lets someone else take the letter on into the dark. Let the lamp grow dim, let your breathing slow down all by itself, without any effort, the breath coming in cool and going out warm, and let the small weight of the day slip down from your shoulders one quiet inch at a time. If you enjoy these long, slow journeys into the past, it does help me greatly if you press the like button and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here, and if you feel like it. Leave your location and your local time down in the comments. It helps other sleepless people find their way here, and there is something quietly lovely in the thought of all of us, scattered across the turning world in 100 different midnights, lying still and listening to the same old story. But that is all. That is everything that will ever be asked of you tonight. Now let the world grow quiet, and let us go back, a very long way back, to a time before there was any such thing as Persia at all. Because before there was a Persian Empire, there was not even a Persia. There was only the land, and the land was old beyond all telling. Picture it from very high up, the way a bird might see it, or a god. In the middle there is a great high plateau, a huge table of land lifted up toward the sky, rimmed on almost every side by mountains, the way a dish is rimmed by its edge. To the west stand the long parallel walls of the Zagros Mountains, ridge after ridge after ridge, like waves of stone rolling forever toward Mesopotamia. To the north, along the shore of a strange inland sea that we call the Caspian, stand the Alborz Mountains, green and wet on one side, bone dry on the other, with one white volcano, Damavand, standing higher than everything, wearing its little flag of cloud. Inside that rim of mountains the plateau itself is high and dry and open, a country of enormous skies, where the light is so clear that mountains 50 miles away look close enough to touch, a country of dust and stone and low tough shrubs, scattered with green valleys wherever water comes down out of the hills, and in its heart lie 2 deserts of such emptiness that even now almost no one crosses them, one of salt and one of sand, shimmering and silent, where the summer heat can crack stone. It is not an easy land, and it has never been an easy land. It is a land that teaches patience, and thrift with water, and long journeys, and it teaches its people to look up, at the mountains and at the huge clean sky, and perhaps that is why the people who came to live there would one day insist that their god was not a statue in a room, but something more like light itself, and could not be kept inside walls. Water is the whole secret of living there. The rivers that come down from the melting snows mostly die in the desert, soaking away into gravel or ending in salt marshes that flash white in the sun, and so from very early times the people of the plateau learned to go and find the water inside the earth itself, in the beds of buried gravel at the feet of the mountains, and they learned, patiently, over generations, to dig long, gently sloping tunnels back into the hills, mile after mile underground, so that the buried water would flow out by itself, cool and clean, into their fields and their villages. These tunnels are called kanats, and they are one of the quiet wonders of the world. From the air their course shows as a long line of little craters marching across the desert. The mouths of the vertical shafts the diggers sank to reach their tunnel, and some of them are more than 20 miles long, and some of them were dug 3,000 years ago and are still flowing tonight, still bringing snow water down to gardens in the desert, which is a kind of miracle if you think about it, a gift handed directly across 100 generations. From people whose names no one will ever know, to people who are alive right now, watering their pomegranate trees from a tunnel dug before Rome was born. Hold that image for a moment, the cool water sliding silently through the dark under the burning desert on its long, slow journey to the light. That is a very Persian thing, that hidden patience. And now, into this old, high, thirsty land, let the people come. They did not come all at once, and they did not come as conquerors, at least not at first. Sometime around 3,000 years ago, and probably for centuries before that, families and clans and whole tribes of herding people came drifting down into the plateau from the grasslands of Central Asia, the way weather drifts, moving with their cattle and their sheep and their horses, and above all their horses, because these were horse people, people who measured wealth in herds and skill in riding, and they spoke a family of languages that scholars call Iranian, which is simply an old word meaning something like the land of the Aryans, the name these people used for themselves. They were cousins in language at least of the peoples who were at the same time drifting down into India, and distant cousins of most of the peoples of Europe. Which is why, if you listen closely, you can still hear old family resemblances between Persian and Greek and Latin and English. The same ancient words for mother and father and brother, for star and door and new, worn smooth by thousands of years, but still recognizably kin, like faces in a very old family photograph. Among these wandering Iranian tribes, two names matter most for our story. One tribe, or gathering of tribes, settled in the northwest of the plateau, in the good green valleys of the Zagros, and they were called the Medes. Another drifted further south, along the mountain rim, into a warm broken country of long valleys and oak forests above the Persian Gulf, and they were called the Parsa, the Persians. And the land they settled took their name, Parsa, which the Greeks would say as Persis, and which is still there on the map of Iran today as the province of Fars. For a long time, and by a long time I mean centuries, nobody who kept written records paid these newcomers much attention, because the plateau was the edge of the world, and the centre of the world, the bright, busy heart of everything, lay down below in the flat river country of Mesopotamia, where cities had already been old for 2,000 years, where writing had been invented, and the wheel had been set to work, and kings in Babylon and Assyria ruled the kind of kingdoms that get remembered. When those lowland kings noticed the plateau at all, it was mostly as a place to raid for horses. Assyrian records mention the Medes and the Parsa almost in passing, lists of hill tribes who paid tribute or failed to pay it. And no Assyrian king lying awake in his palace at Nineveh ever lost a moment of sleep, we can be sure, worrying about shepherds in the Zagros. History is full of these quiet ironies and tends to hand them out with a perfectly straight face. But the plateau was not empty when the Iranians came, and it had its own old civilization already, and we should pause and pay our respects, because almost everyone forgets it. Down in the southwest, where the mountains step down onto the edge of the Mesopotamian plain, there was a kingdom called Elam, with its great city of Susa. And Elam was ancient beyond easy imagining, as old as Sumer, as old as anything, a civilization that had been building cities and writing its own strange language on clay for more than 2,000 years before a single Persian tent was. Pitched in the hills above it, the Elamites built stepped temple towers like the Mesopotamians, and fought Babylon and Assyria as an equal for centuries, and near their city of Susa there still stands, tonight, the great brick ziggurat of Chogha Zanbil, one of the best preserved in all the world, its mud bricks stamped with royal inscriptions, standing silent under the stars in the middle of an empty plain more than 3,000 years old. Remember Elam, because when the Persians came down into those valleys, poor cousins from the hills, it was Elam that taught them. From the Elamites the Persians would take their first lessons in writing, in administration, in kingship, in how a palace is run, and how a treasury is kept. The way a young family moving into an old neighbourhood learns from the people who have always lived there. Civilizations are not born out of nothing. They are handed things, quietly, by older neighbours, and the Persians, to their lasting credit, were very good at accepting gifts. Meanwhile, up in the north, their cousins the Medes were learning harder lessons from a harsher teacher. Because the northern Zagros lay in the shadow of Assyria, and Assyria was the superpower of the age, the most efficient military machine the world had yet produced, and being Assyria's neighbour was a little like living next door to a thunderstorm. Assyrian armies came up into the hills again and again, burning villages, carrying off herds and people, cutting their victories into stone reliefs with a frankness that can still make a museum visitor's blood run cold. And the Medes did what people under that kind of pressure often do. They organised. Scattered clans that had been happy to feud with one another began, slowly, to hold together, first around war leaders, then around something like a king, and tradition remembers a Median royal line. Names like Cyrus, and a capital growing up at a place called Ecbatana, the modern city of Hamadan, high in the cool hills, a city which later legends said was ringed by 7 walls, each painted a different colour, rising to a citadel of silver and gold, which is almost certainly a fairy tale, but it is the kind of fairy tale that gathers around a place that mattered. And by the late 600s before the birth of Christ, the Medes mattered very much, because Assyria, that permanent thunderstorm, was finally wearing itself out, exhausted by its own endless wars and its own crushing weight, and its subjects and neighbours could feel it, the way animals feel weather changing. What happened next was one of the great settlings of accounts in ancient history. The Medes came down out of the hills, and the Babylonians rose up out of the south, and the two of them together fell upon Assyria, and in the year 612 before the birth of Christ, the allied armies took Nineveh itself, the queen of cities, the capital of the world, and burned it so thoroughly that within a few generations grass grew over the mounds and people were no longer quite sure where it had been. Empires had fallen before, but never one so great, so suddenly. The lesson would not be lost on anyone who came after, and least of all on the Persians, who watched from their southern valleys as their Median cousins carved up the world's greatest empire and became, overnight, one of the great powers of the earth. When the dust of Nineveh settled, the ancient world had arranged itself into a kind of uneasy family of 4 great kingdoms, and it is worth walking slowly around that world once, because it is the stage on which our whole story is about to be played. In the centre, holding the rich river country and the huge inheritance of Mesopotamian civilization, stood Babylon, newly glorious, where King Nebuchadnezzar was raising walls so vast that they were numbered among the wonders of the world, and gates of glazed blue brick paraded with golden lions and dragons, one of which, the Ishtar Gate, you can stand in front of tonight in a museum in Berlin, still blazing blue after 26 centuries. To the west, in the highlands of what is now Turkey, lay the kingdom of Lydia, small but fabulously rich, because the streams that ran down from its mountains carried gold dust, and the Lydians had lately invented something that would quietly change the world more than any army ever did. They had begun striking small stamped lumps of precious metal of a guaranteed weight and purity, which is to say, they had invented coins, actual money, and their king Croesus had become a byword for wealth, so that even now, when we say rich as Croesus, we are quoting the ancient world's opinion of Lydia. To the south lay Egypt, old past counting, wrapped in its river and its rituals, watchful and wealthy and inclined to let others do the fighting. And in the north and east, holding the mountains from Anatolia to the edge of the plateau, stood the Medes, horse lords now dressed in the borrowed splendour of the empires they had helped to bury. And down in the southern hills of the Median world, in the long warm valleys of Persia, there lived a small subject people, sworn to the Median king, herding their flocks, tending their little irrigated orchards, paying their tribute more or less on time, and ruled by their own minor local dynasty, kings of a little place called Anshan, an old Elamite title for an old Elamite town, kings whose family name, or clan name, or perhaps the name of an honoured ancestor, was Achaemenes. Nobody outside those valleys had any reason to know that name, Inside a single lifetime, it would be stamped on the whole world, and the family of Achaemenes, the Achaemenids, would rule from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, and the greatest of them all, the one who began it, was born, probably around the year 600 before the birth of Christ, a boy of that small hill dynasty, half Persian and, if the old stories are right, half Median, grandson through his mother of the Median king himself. And his name was Kurush, which the Greeks would soften into Kyros, and which we say in English as Cyrus. Now, when a man ends up ruling the world goes back afterward and decorates his childhood, and Cyrus received the full treatment. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing about a century later, collected the stories that were told around Persian fires, and the one he liked best goes like this. The Median king Astyages, Cyrus's grandfather, dreamed one night that a vine grew from his sleeping daughter and spread its shade across the whole of Asia, and his dream readers told him, with the nervous honesty of court officials everywhere, that this meant his daughter's son would take his throne. So Astyages married the girl safely away to a quiet Persian vassal, and when a boy was born, he ordered a trusted kinsman to make the child disappear into the mountains, and the kinsman, unwilling to have royal blood on his own hands, passed the task to a herdsman, and the herdsman's wife, who had just lost a baby of her own, looked at the living child and made the obvious human choice, and the herdsman buried his own dead son in the prince's rich clothes and raised the prince as his own. And the boy grew up strong and unusually kingly for a cowherd's son, so much so that at 10 years old, playing at being king with the village boys, he had a nobleman's son whipped for disobedience with such natural authority that the matter came before Astyages himself, who looked into the boy's face and asked questions and understood exactly what he was looking at. It is a perfect story, and it is almost certainly not true, and it did not need to be true. It needed to be told. Because it says the thing ancient people wanted said about Cyrus, that his rise was fated, written in dreams before he could walk, and that he was raised close to the earth, among herdsmen, a king who knew what ordinary bread tasted like. What we actually know is simpler and still remarkable. Around the year 559 before the birth of Christ, Cyrus became king of Anshan, vassal of his grandfather Astyages, and about a decade later, the two of them came to war, grandfather and grandson, and the war ended in the strangest and most telling way, because when the two armies met, a great part of the Median army simply changed sides, handed over its own king, and went home with the Persians. Astyages had been a hard and haughty master, and his nobles had had enough of him, and there, in that single bloodless-sounding sentence, half the secret of Cyrus is already visible. Men who are supposed to fight him decided they would rather follow him, and that would go on happening for the rest of his life. And notice what Cyrus did not do next, because the whole ancient world noticed. He did not burn Ecbatana. He did not enslave the Medes. He did not even, as far as we can tell, harm Astyages, who was kept honourably at court, an arrangement which must have made for some awkward family dinners, but which announced a policy. The Medes kept their homes, their honours, and their offices. Median nobles would serve beside Persian ones at the highest levels of everything that came after, and the world outside scarcely knew whether to call the new power Media or Persia, and for centuries the Greeks, covering their bets, would use the two words almost interchangeably. Cyrus had grasped, at the very beginning, the idea that would build the empire, that yesterday's enemy, treated with honour, is tomorrow's cavalry. Word of all this travelled west, and it was heard with particular interest in Lydia, where rich King Croesus reigned, and Croesus decided the moment had come to test the new power in the east while it was young. Being a careful man, he first sent messengers to the famous Greek oracle at Delphi to ask what would happen if he marched against the Persians, and the oracle sent back one of the most famous answers in all of history, that if Croesus crossed the river Halys and attacked, he would destroy a great empire. Croesus, delighted, marched. There was a hard-drawn battle at the frontier. And then, since the campaigning season was ending, Croesus did the sensible conventional thing. He went home for the winter and dismissed his hired troops, expecting everyone to resume killing each other properly in the spring, as civilized nations did. Cyrus did not go home. He came on through the winter, across country everyone knew an army could not cross in winter, and appeared before the Lydian capital of Sardis with Croesus's cavalry, the best in the world, hastily assembled to meet him. And here Cyrus, or his general Harpagus the Mede, produced one of history's odder pieces of battlefield imagination. They put the army's baggage camels in the front line. Because horses that have never met camels cannot abide their smell, and the splendid Lydian cavalry dissolved as its horses wheeled and bolted, and the Lydian knights, to their honour, jumped down and fought on foot, and lost. Sardis fell after a brief siege, and the oracle of course had told the exact truth. Croesus had destroyed a great empire, his own, a lesson in reading the fine print that the Greeks would retell forever, with a particular relish people reserved for the misfortunes of the very rich. As for Croesus himself, the legend says Cyrus spared him at the last moment and kept him as a counsellor, and whether or not that is literally true, it is once again the story everyone believed about Cyrus, because it fit him. Sparing kings was becoming his signature. With Lydia fell the Greek cities of the Anatolian coast, bright quarrelsome little places with names like Miletus and Ephesus, which submitted one by one to Persian governors, and this quiet event, barely a footnote in the great sweep of that decade, set the fuse for almost everything dramatic that happens later in our story. Because from now on there would be Greeks inside the empire looking out, and Greeks outside the empire looking in, and that long uneasy acquaintance would eventually give the world Marathon and Thermopylae and Alexander. But all of that is far away still, generations away. And nobody standing in the ruins of Sardis could have imagined any of it. Now only Babylon was left, the greatest city on earth, the centre of the civilized world. And what happened there in the year 539 before the birth of Christ ought by every rule of ancient history to have been a catastrophe, a siege, a famine, a burning, and instead it is one of the strangest anticlimaxes in the whole ancient record, because Babylon fell in a night, and the accounts agree that it fell essentially without a fight. Its own king, Nabonidus, was a strange, unpopular figure who had neglected the city's great god Marduk, and gone off to live for years in the Arabian desert, pursuing his private devotion to the moon god, leaving his son Belshazzar to hold the capital, and the priests of Marduk and a good part of the city seemed to have decided, like the Median nobles before them, that the Persian was preferable to their own master. One tradition says the Persians diverted the river Euphrates into a marsh and walked into the city along the drained riverbed under the walls during a festival while Babylon danced. The biblical book of Daniel remembers that last night as the night of Belshazzar's feast, when a hand appeared and wrote on the palace wall that the kingdom had been weighed and found wanting and given to the Medes and the Persians. And whatever one makes of that story, it preserves the essential historical truth, which is the speed, the sense of a verdict delivered, an old world signed over to a new one between dusk and dawn. And once again, and now on the greatest stage on earth, Cyrus did the unexpected thing, which had become his most expected thing. There was no sack. The temples stood. The daily offerings to Marduk continued without a single missed morning. Cyrus entered Babylon, the record says, in peace, was received as a liberator, took the hands of the statue of Marduk as a lawful Babylonian king would, and issued a proclamation which was stamped into a clay cylinder that archaeologists dug out of the ruins 24 centuries later, and which you can go and see tonight in the British Museum, a barrel of baked clay about the size of a loaf of bread, covered in dense cuneiform writing, in which Cyrus declares that he entered the city without battle, that he ended the abuses of the previous king, that he let the deported peoples held in Babylon go home and take their gods with them, and rebuild their ruined sanctuaries. Among those freed peoples, though the cylinder does not name them, were the Judeans, carried into exile decades earlier when Nebuchadnezzar burned Jerusalem, and their scriptures remember Cyrus with an astonishment that still glows off the page. The only foreigner in the entire Hebrew Bible to be called God's anointed, the shepherd who would order Jerusalem rebuilt. Think of that for a moment. A Persian king, worshipper of foreign gods, remembered in another people's holy book as an instrument of their God, because he let the exiles go home. Conquerors had been many. This was something new. In the space of about 20 years then, a vassal king of a hill country the size of a modest modern province had gathered in Media, Lydia and Babylonia, which is to say every great power of Western Asia except Egypt, and stitched them into a single realm larger than anything that had ever existed anywhere on earth. And it is worth lying still for a moment and asking, quietly, how? Part of the answer is the army, of course, and the horses, and the winter marches, and the camels, and the sheer opportunism of genius. But the larger part, the part that made the empire last instead of falling apart at his death like every previous conqueror's patchwork, was the policy, and the policy was, by the standards of the ancient world, very close to revolutionary. The Assyrians had ruled by terror, deporting whole nations, salting the earth, decorating their palaces with carvings of the punishments they inflicted, and it had won them 2 centuries of power, and such a harvest of hatred that when they fell, nobody, anywhere was sorry. Cyrus ruled, as far as we can see, by permission. Keep your gods, he said in substance. Keep your languages, your laws, your ways of dressing and marrying and burying. Keep your local princes if they are sensible. Pay your taxes, furnish your soldiers when the king calls. Do not rebel, and the king's peace will cover you like a roof. It sounds simple, and it sounds almost obvious now, and that is precisely his monument. The idea became obvious because it worked, and every durable multinational empire afterward, the Romans very much included, was in one way or another running Cyrus's software on new machines, which is, when you think about it, a strange kind of immortality for a shepherd king from the hills of Fars, and rather a good one. He built himself a capital at last, but even his capital tells you about the man. Because Pasargadae is not a fortress and barely a city, it is a garden. On a high green plain in his home country, watered by a river out of the mountains, Cyrus laid out a great walled park in the Persian style, a paradisa, planted in ordered groves, threaded with narrow stone water channels that still lie across the grass today, geometrical, silvery, feeding small square basins, and among the trees and the water he set graceful columned pavilions, open to the breeze on every side, so that the king of the world lived, when he was at home, essentially in a tent of stone in an orchard, a nomad's dream made permanent. And at the edge of the plain he built the small building he is still known by, and we will come back to it before this night is over, because it is one of the quietest and most moving places in the ancient world. His tomb, a little gabled stone house the size of a garden shed, set on 6 high stone steps, plain as bread, without one carving or one boast anywhere on it. The man who owned the earth ordered, for himself, a cottage on a stair. In the end, the step took him back, around 530 before the birth of Christ, campaigning on the far northeastern frontier against the horse tribes beyond the river Jaxartes, in the kind of open grass country his ancestors had come wandering out of centuries before. Cyrus was killed. Herodotus tells a grim and famous tale about it, that the nomad queen Tomyris, whose son had died in the war, found the king's body on the field and pushed his severed head into a skin filled with blood, telling him to drink his fill at last, and again no one can say if it is true, and the very fact that the Greeks told it shows how enormous he had become in the world's imagination, a man whose death required a myth. His body came home to Pasargadae, to the little stone house on its steps, laid on a golden couch, and for 2 centuries a guild of priests kept the tomb, sacrificing a horse each month, tending a fire, guarding a garden around a grave. We are told that when Alexander of Macedon took the empire 200 years later, he came to Pasargadae, and found the tomb broken open by robbers in the chaos of the conquest, and was genuinely grieved, and had it restored and sealed. One empire builder paying his respects to the first of the breed, and inside, tradition says, there was an inscription, and though no trace of it survives in the stone, the ancient writers recorded it, and it is worth hearing in the dark. O man, whoever you are and wherever you come from, for I know you will come, I am Cyrus, who founded the empire of the Persians. Do not grudge me this little earth that covers my body. The tomb is still there tonight, on its quiet plain in Iran, plain as ever, the oldest substantially intact royal tomb of its kind on earth, and the wind comes down off the mountains and moves across the dry grass around it, exactly as it did 25 centuries ago. And if any building on this planet has earned a good night's sleep, it is that one. His son inherited the world, and the world held its breath. The son was called Cambyses, and history has been unkind to him, partly because he earned it, and partly because the people who wrote the histories had reasons to blacken him, and at this distance it is hard to tell the earned part from the invented part. What he certainly did was finish his father's unfinished business, which was Egypt, the last of the old great powers still standing apart. In 525 before the birth of Christ, Cambyses marched an army across the terrible desert road of northern Sinai, arranged, with typical Persian forethought, for the Arab tribes of the desert to station camel trains of water along the way, defeated the Pharaoh's army in a brutal battle at the mouth of the Nile, and took Memphis, and with it the oldest kingdom in the world, and the Persian Empire now ran from the Aegean to Nubia and touched 3 continents, the largest state by an enormous margin that had ever existed. The Greeks later told lurid stories about Cambyses in Egypt, that he mocked the gods, that he stabbed the sacred Apis bull, that he went mad, and Egyptian records suggest much of this is slander. That he in fact played the pharaoh correctly and buried an Apis bull with full honours, but something in the reign was genuinely curdling. The swagger of the second generation, perhaps. The son of the great man with everything to prove and nothing left to conquer but sand. An expedition sent up the Nile and out to the western oasis went badly, and one army, the story says, marched into the desert toward the oracle of Amun and was swallowed whole by a sandstorm and never seen again, 50,000 men, and though archaeologists have hunted for its bones for 2 centuries, the desert has kept them. And then, in the year 522, with the king far from home, word ran through the empire that his brother had seized the throne back in Persia, and Cambyses, hurrying home to deal with it, died on the road, of an accidental wound or despair or something quieter and more deliberate, no one knows, and the empire, 8 years old as a world state, tipped straight into crisis, and out of that crisis came the man who would give the empire its lasting shape, and he came sideways, through a door that history has never quite been able to see through clearly. His name was Darius. He was a young officer of the royal guard, and a Achaemenid of a junior branch, and the story he himself told, carved gigantically into a cliff face for all time, goes like this. The man on the throne was not the king's brother at all, because Cambyses had secretly murdered his real brother years before, and the man now wearing the diadem was an impostor, a Magian priest named Galmata, who merely resembled the dead prince, and the whole empire had been deceived, and so Darius, with 6 noble companions, rode to the palace and killed the false king and took the throne as the rightful avenger of the royal house. That is the official version. It is a very convenient version, you will notice, for Darius, and historians have squinted at it for 2,000 years with the polite expression of a banker examining a doubtful cheque, because there is at least one other way to read the same events, in which the man on the throne was exactly who he said he was, the true brother, the true king, and the impostor story was invented afterward by the ambitious young officer who had, to put it plainly, killed him and needed the killing to be holy. We will never know. The only witness who could settle it carved his testimony into a mountain, and he is not a neutral witness, and it is one of the quiet lessons of all history, worth turning over once as you drift, that the past comes down to us told by the people who won, and that a cliff face can lie as smoothly as a courtier. What is certain is that the empire nearly came apart in his hands. Province after province rose, Babylon, Media, Elam, the eastern lands, a dozen rebellions in a single year, pretenders sprouting like grass after rain, and it says everything about the machine Cyrus built and the man now driving it, that within about 19 months Darius had put all of it down, marching and countermarking with a speed his enemies could not believe, and by the end of it he was, beyond all argument, King of Kings. And he had learned better than anyone alive how fragile a world empire is, and he set about, with the cold clear focus of a man who had seen the abyss, making sure it could never wobble like that again. First he told the story, his story, in a way no one could ever miss. On the great road between Babylon and Ecbatana, where every caravan in Asia passed, there is a mountain called Behistun, and 100 meters up its sheer rock face Darius had carved an enormous relief, the king life sized with his foot on the fallen pretender, the rebel leaders roped neck to neck before him, the winged emblem of God floating above, and around and beneath the figures, column after column of writing, thousands of lines, the whole official account of the crisis and his victory. And he had it written 3 times over in 3 languages of the empire, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, so that every literate traveller from any land could read it, and then, when it was finished, he had the ledge the carvers stood on cut away, so that no human hand could ever reach it to change a word. It is still there. Nothing has changed a word in 2,500 years. Keep Behistun in mind, because near the end of our story that 3-fold inscription is going to unlock something wonderful. But that is for later, when the night is deeper. Then he organised, and here in the quiet paperwork, more than on any battlefield, the Persian Empire became the thing the world remembered. Darius divided the whole vast realm into provinces, about 20 of them, each called a satrapy, each under a governor called a satrap, a word that simply means protector of the realm, and each satrapy was assessed for a fixed annual tribute, so much silver from Babylon, so much gold dust from India, horses from Media, grain from Egypt, and the assessments were written down. And the scribes kept the accounts, and for the first time in human history one may fairly say that most of the civilized world was run out of ledgers by an administration in multiple languages with copies filed. The Greeks, who mocked most things foreign, did not mock this. They called Darius, half in jest and wholly in awe, the shopkeeper, because everything was counted. And the jest has worn better than most compliments, because it is the shopkeepers of the world, not its heroes, who keep the lamps lit and the bread arriving, as anyone who has run a household knows. And because a governor with an army, a treasury, and 1,000 miles between himself and his master is a temptation waiting patiently for its moment, Darius built the quiet machinery of watchfulness. Royal secretaries in every provincial capital who reported directly to the court, travelling inspectors who arrived unannounced with full authority to audit anything, men known in the records by a phrase that has never been improved upon in all the centuries of espionage since: the king's eyes and the king's ears. No satrap ever knew which polite stranger at his table wrote to the palace. It was not terror, exactly. It was attention. The empire ran on attention. And to carry all of it, the reports and the inspectors and the tribute and the armies and the mail, he perfected the thing we began this night with, the road. The royal road ran from Sardis near the Aegean coast east through Anatolia, across the Euphrates, down through Mesopotamia to Susa, and on toward the heart of Persia. More than 1,600 miles of maintained, patrolled, measured highway, with 111 relay stations, a day's ride apart, each with its stable of fresh horses standing ready, and the system of relay riders whose job description Herodotus set down in a sentence so fine that a version of it is carved tonight over the doors of the New York City post office. That neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. A letter could go from the Aegean to Susa in a week. An ordinary traveller took 3 months. There had never been anything like it on Earth, and there would not be anything meaningfully faster until the railway, 23 centuries later. And I want you to notice, gently, that you have seen this road before, because the rider we watched in the very beginning of tonight's story, the young man with the sealed letter, riding down the long slope into the blue evening. He was riding this road. One of those 111 stations was the fire ahead of him in the dark, and the king whose seal he carried was Darius or one of his line. And now you know what the letter rode through, not empty land, but an empire humming with counted, tended, watched-over order, and the rider himself never thought about it once, which was exactly the point. The deepest success of a civilization is what its people no longer have to think about. He reformed the money too, striking a royal coin of pure gold that the whole world came to call the daric, the archer coin stamped with the running king holding his bow, and merchants from Athens to India trusted it for 2 centuries without weighing it, which is its own quiet epitaph for a government. He dug things, this shopkeeper king. In Egypt, his engineers reopened and finished an enormous canal begun by the pharaohs joining the Nile to the Red Sea. An ancestor of the Suez Canal cut 24 centuries before the modern one, and Darius set up granite stones along it, boasting with a geographer's plain delight that ships now sailed from Egypt to Persia as he had commanded. Under the Persian peace, the Qanat tunnels spread across the plateau and far beyond it, because the crown gave tax rewards to men who brought new water to dry land, which is the sort of imperial policy that never gets a statue and deserves 100. And out of these same years comes the loveliest of all Persian inventions, which is not an object at all, but a place. The walled garden, the paradisa, the protected green square in the brown land, with its straight water channels crossing at the centre, its fruit trees in ordered rows, its shade and birdsong sealed away from the dust. And the Greeks borrowed the word as paradisos, and when Greek-speaking translators much later needed a word for the Garden of Eden and for heaven itself, that is the word they reached for. And so it is that whenever anyone tonight, in any church or mosque or poem or song, speaks of paradise, they are speaking Persian. They are describing a green garden with water running through it on a high dry plain in Iran, which seems to me one of the most beautiful facts in the world, and a good one to be carrying as you drift. And there was one more thing under everything, quieter than roads or coins, and that was the faith. Somewhere back in the deep past of the Iranian peoples, no one knows quite when or where, a priest and poet named Zarathustra, whom the Greeks called Zoroaster, had taught a startling thing, that behind the crowded quarrelling gods of the old world there was really one great struggle. Between truth and the lie, light and darkness, and one supreme lord of wisdom, Ahura Mazda, uncreated and good, and that every human soul was free, and required to choose a side, in every act, every day, and that the whole of a person's religion could be folded into 3 words, good thoughts, good words, good deeds, and that at the end of all things light would win. Fire was the emblem of that purity, tended in open temples, never worshipped itself, only honoured as the visible sign of the invisible light, and the kings of Persia, from Darius on, wrote Ahura Mazda's name above everything they did. By the favour of Ahura Mazda the fearsome king, says Darius at Behistun, and the winged disk floats over his carved head like a blessing. The empire never forced the faith on anyone, which is by now, you will notice, the most Persian sentence in this whole story. Babylon kept Marduk, and Egypt kept its whole crowded heaven, and the Jews kept their one god, and Greece kept its quarrelsome Olympians, all under a king who believed the world was a single moral battlefield of light. Scholars still argue about how much of later religion learnt from Persia in those centuries, ideas like a devil, a last judgment, a saviour to come, angels, heaven. But the arguing itself is the tribute, and Zarathustra's faith is not a museum piece. It is alive tonight, tended by communities in Iran and by the Parsis of India, whose very name means Persians, and in fire temples where some flames, it is said, have been kept burning without a single dark hour for more than 1,000 years. Good thoughts, good words, good deeds. Empires have been built on worse foundations, and most have been. So picture the world Darius had made, somewhere around the year 500 before the birth of Christ, because no one in all previous history had ever stood where he stood. From a window of his palace at Susa, the king's writ ran west across 2,000 miles to the Greek cities of the Aegean shore, east across 2,000 more to the Indus, south up the Nile past the first cataract, north to the cold rivers of the steppe. Perhaps one human being in every 3 or 4 then alive on the entire planet paid taxes, ultimately to Darius. 44% of humankind, one careful modern estimate says, lived inside that single realm, a share no empire since, not Rome, not the Mongols, not the British, has ever matched. And the strange, almost embarrassing truth that the ancient Greek writers themselves let slip between their war stories is that most of those millions were, by the standards of the age, fortunate. The roads were safe, the measures were honest, the harvests were counted but not stolen, the gods were left alone. A traveller, Herodotus says, could carry gold across the empire and fear nothing but the weather. There was a word the Persians used for the king's realm at peace, and their kings repeat it in inscription after inscription like a prayer. Not victory, not glory, but happiness. Shiati, may Ahura Mazda protect this land, they wrote, from the enemy army, from famine, and from the lie. That was the empire at noon. Hold it in the light for a moment, because histories written by its enemies have taught the world to hurry past this part, to get to the battles, and we will get to the battles. But you were owed the noon first, the counted, watered, garden-planted noon of the First World Empire, the largest thing anyone had ever built out of human agreement. And for its era, very possibly the gentlest. And because every noon wants a monument, Darius built one, and it is the one you have seen, even if you do not know you have seen it. Because when the modern world wants a single picture that says ancient Persia, it reaches every time for the same great stone stair and the same forest of impossibly slender columns against a bare brown mountain, and that place is Persepolis. He began it around 518 before the birth of Christ, in the old Persian homeland of Fars, on a natural stone terrace at the foot of a mountain the Persians called the Mount of Mercy, and the name they gave the place was simply Parsa, city of the Persians. Persepolis is what the Greeks called it, and it was never really a city at all in the ordinary sense. Not a place of markets and traffic and ordinary mornings. It was built for one thing, ceremony, a stage of grey stone half the size of a small town, raised 40 feet above the plain on a platform of blocks so large that people in later ages assumed giants or demons had stacked them, and you climbed onto it by a double stairway broad enough and shallow enough, it is always said, for horses to be ridden up, each step cut low and easy, because a king's dignity does not hurry. At the top you passed through the Gate of All Nations, a square hall whose doorways were flanked by colossal stone bulls, and winged bulls with the calm, bearded faces of men, guardians in the old Assyrian manner, standing where they still stand tonight, weathered and enormous. Having watched every visitor for 2,500 years, and beyond the gate rose the audience halls, the Apadana, whose roof of cedar from Lebanon was carried 70 feet in the air on columns slim as reeds. Each one crowned with the strangest and loveliest capital in the whole history of architecture, the joined foreparts of 2 kneeling bulls, back to back, holding the roof beams in the saddle between their necks. 13 of those columns still stand against the sky of Fars tonight, out of the original 72, and travellers who have seen every ruin on earth still go quiet on that stair. But the true treasure of Persepolis is not its size, it is its carvings, because up the sides of the great stairways the builders cut, in low relief, in row above row, a procession, the whole empire walking in stone, and it is all still there, sharp as yesterday in places, protected for centuries by the very ash and rubble that buried it. Delegations from every one of the subject peoples, each in their own dress, each led by an usher who holds the first man kindly by the hand, and each bringing the gift of their land. Medes in their round felt caps bringing horses, Lydians with vases and bracelets of gold, Babylonians with woven cloth and a humped bull, Egyptians, Arabs leading a camel, Ethiopians with ivory, Indians in loincloths carrying gold dust in baskets, Scythians in their pointed hoods bringing a stallion, 23 nations in all, walking calmly, forever, up the stone stairs toward the king. And here is the thing every visitor eventually notices, and it is the whole empire in a single observation. Nobody in that procession is roped. Nobody kneels on a neck. Nobody is being trampled under a chariot. There are no heaps of enemy heads, which were the ordinary decorative vocabulary of every previous empire's palace art, and after the Assyrian reliefs, which are a museum of screaming. The stairways of Persepolis are almost shocking in their mildness. Guests at a dinner party, carved for eternity, bringing presents to a host. It was propaganda, of course. Everything on a palace wall is propaganda. But you learn a great deal about a government from what it chooses to lie about, and Assyria wanted you to believe you would be flayed, and Persia wanted you to believe you would be welcomed, taken by the hand, and led up the easy stairs. The occasion all that stone is forever celebrating was, most scholars think, the spring festival, the New Year, held at the vernal equinox when the sun crosses into spring, the festival that Iranians tonight still keep as Nowruz, New Day, 25 centuries later. With the house scrubbed and the table laid with green-sprouting wheat and painted eggs and goldfish. And in the empire's great days it seems to have been the moment when the court assembled at Persepolis and the nations came up the stair with their gifts and the king sat enthroned in the 100-column hall. And we even know, in a homely way, what such gatherings ate, because the palace accounts survive. Sheep and lambs and bread and beer and wine in torrents, figs and dates and pistachios, and the kitchens of the king fed thousands on festival days, nobles and grooms and stone carvers and serving women alike. And that homely detail opens the trapdoor into the most surprising thing at Persepolis, which is not made of stone at all. In the 1930s, archaeologists clearing a corner of the terrace found 2 rooms packed with tens of thousands of small clay tablets, dry and grey as biscuits, the working files of the palace administration. Written mostly in Elamite, that old borrowed language of the accountants, and when they were read, out came, not kings and battles, but payroll. Ration lists. Travel vouchers. Work rosters. The daily bureaucratic breathing of the empire, preserved by the lucky accident that clay, unlike paper, is improved by a burning building. And in those tablets the invisible people of the ancient world suddenly walk into the light. Work gangs of men and women, Persians, Elamites, Babylonians, Ionians, drawing their wages in grain and wine and sheep. Women working as stone polishers and wood carvers and seamstresses, and, listen to this, 4 women recorded by title as chiefs of their work groups, drawing higher pay than the men under them, and mothers on the rosters drawing extra rations for a month after childbirth. A little more if the baby was a boy, a little less if a girl, which is the ancient world being the ancient world, but drawing it, by right, on file, from the king. Travellers on official business carrying sealed tablets that entitled them to bread and beer at the way stations. The world's first expense accounts, some of them stamped by the very officials whose names we know, and one tablet records fast messengers drawing rations, and another records flour issued to a courier passing through on the king's business, and somewhere in that grey archive, in some unread or long-crumbled entry, there was once, we may be allowed to imagine, a line of Elamite bookkeeping that was nothing other than our rider from the beginning of the night, his name, his station, his loaf, his jar, his horse. Because that is what the empire was under all its glory, not a boast on a cliff, but a ledger in a storeroom, millions of small kept promises, bread for work, fodder for horses. Wages for the woman who polished the stone bull's face until it shone. The lion and the bull are carved on the stairway too. The lion forever pulling down the bull, spring forever killing winter, the year forever turning. And the accountants in the room behind the wall went on counting sheep. And if there is a better portrait of civilization than that, a myth on the wall and a ledger behind it, I have never met it. The kings themselves lived, by the standards of later despots, on the move and almost modestly, migrating with the seasons like their nomad ancestors, winter at Susa in the warm lowlands, high summer at Ecbatana in the cool hills, spring at Persepolis for the festival, the whole court packing and travelling, a linen city of tents moving across the empire with its carpets and its archives and its ice. And yes, it's ice, because the Persians had learned to make and keep ice in the desert, building great domed ice houses of mud brick, some of which still stand, where winter ice, made in shallow pools on freezing plateau nights behind high shade walls, was stacked under straw and kept all summer, so that the King of Kings could drink chilled wine in July, in the desert. 23 centuries before the refrigerator, and honestly, once you know that human beings solved iced drinks in the desert that long ago, the rest of civilization feels like elaboration. Around the king spread the court, the 7 great families who had stood with Darius, the guard of 1,000 spearmen whose spear butts were golden apples, the 10,000 soldiers of the standing royal regiment whom the Greeks called the Immortals, because whenever one died or fell sick another stepped instantly into his place, so that the number never changed, which seemed uncanny to outsiders, and was, once again, merely superb bookkeeping wearing a frightening name. And through it all walked the protocols that so amazed the Greeks, the bowing that Greeks refused until their knees were argued into it a century and a half later, the rule that one does not speak first to the king, the royal table from which the king sent dishes to men he wished to honour, the king's wine, the king's water, brought boiled from one particular river in silver flasks, wherever on earth he travelled, because the king of the world drank from one river only, the Coaspes, which is the kind of detail that sounds like myth and comes to us in fact from the sober historians, and which I offer you now simply as a picture, the silver flasks of river water swaying on mule back across 2,000 miles of empire, so that a man who owned the world could taste, every evening, no matter where he lay, the water of home. Persepolis was the ceremony, but the working capital, the everyday great house, was Susa, old Elamite Susa down in the warm lowlands, and Darius rebuilt it from the ground up, and we happen to know exactly how, because his builders buried, in the foundations, tablets bearing the king's own account of the work, the foundation charter of the palace, and it is less a boast than a hymn to the size of the world, and it deserves to be heard at night, slowly the way it was meant. This palace which I built at Susa, says Darius, its materials were brought from afar. The cedar timber was brought from a mountain called Lebanon, and the Assyrians carried it to Babylon, and from Babylon the Carians and the Ionians brought it to Susa. The Sisu timber was brought from Gandhara and from Carmania. The gold was brought from Sardis and from Bactria. The precious stone lapis lazuli and carnelian was brought from Sogdiana. The turquoise was brought from Chorasmia. The silver and the ebony were brought from Egypt. The ornamentation with which the wall was adorned was brought from Ionia. The ivory was brought from Ethiopia and from Sind and from Arachosia. The stone columns were brought from a village called Aberadu in Elam. The stone cutters who wrought the stone, those were Ionians and Sardians. The goldsmiths were Medes and Egyptians. The men who wrought the wood, those were Sardians and Egyptians. The men who wrought the baked brick, those were Babylonians. The men who adorned the wall, those were Medes and Egyptians. And then the king says, at Susa a very excellent work was ordered. A very excellent work was brought to completion, and you can hear, under the formula, something close to wonder. Because what the charter is really describing, if you stand back from it, is the first building in the history of the world that the whole world built. Cedar men and gold men and brick men from 3 continents working on one house, paid from one treasury, fed from one kitchen. And when the archaeologists dug Susa, they found it all just as the tablet said, the column bases from Elam, the glazed Babylonian brickwork, the Ionian chisel marks, the charter checked against the building, and the building against the charter, 24 centuries later, and the account was found to balance, which would have pleased the shopkeeper king more, I suspect, than any poem. And the craftsmen of that world deserve a moment of their own, because the empire's beauty was not all architecture. Much of it you could hold in your hand, and some of it you still can. In the 1870s, on the banks of the river Oxus far in the northeast of the old empire, there came to light a hoard of worked gold, the Oxus treasure, armlets ending in leaping winged griffins, tiny golden chariots complete with tiny drivers and 4 tiny horses, votive plaques and vessels and rings, the goldsmith's art of the Achaemenid age. And it sits tonight in the British Museum a few rooms from the Cyrus cylinder, and the griffin armlets are of a kind you can see. If you look closely, on the arms of the tribute bearers carved at Persepolis, the carving and the surviving object confirming each other across the whole width of the vanished empire. And the gold work is so assured, so liquid, that jewellers today study it with a kind of humility. The weavers were their equals, and we know it by a miracle of ice, because far away on the Siberian steppe, in tombs at a place called Pazyryk, permafrost preserved textiles from roughly the empire's own centuries, and among them lies the oldest known knotted pile carpet in the world, the Pazyryk carpet. Its border walked by processions of horsemen that could have stepped off the Persepolis stair, woven, many scholars think, within the Persian world or under its direct influence. 25 centuries ago, and still glowing crimson in its museum case in St. Petersburg, and every Persian carpet knotted tonight, in Tabriz or Isfahan or Qom, every garden-patterned rug with its central pool and its 4 flowing channels and its borders of blossom, is the direct descendant of that craft, the walled paradise garden translated into wool. So that a family in any city of the world who rolls out a Persian rug on a cold evening is, strictly speaking, unrolling a garden, planted in the reign of kings whose names they need never know, and there is something wonderfully restful in that. The idea that a civilization can fold its whole paradise into a rectangle of wool and mail it down the centuries to warm the floors of strangers. Even the empire's sound has not entirely left us, if you listen sideways, because the Greeks record the Persian court's love of music at the feast, the harps and the flutes and the singing of the deeds of kings, and the long tradition of Persian classical song that survives today. The Radif, with its old modes handed master to pupil for generations uncounted, is held by its own tradition to descend from the music of the ancient courts, and whether or not a musicologist would sign every clause of that, it is true in the way that matters at bedtime. The plateau has been singing in something like the same voice for a very long time. Low and ornamented and patient. The sound of a dry land that loves gardens, and if you have ever heard a Persian neigh, the reed flute, breathing in the dark, you have heard what homesickness sounded like on the royal roads, because the oldest Persian poem about the neigh says it sings because it has been cut from the reed bed, and longs to return, which is, when you think about it, every traveller on every road of every empire, and every one of us at the end of a long day. And the cure the old world prescribed is the one you are taking right now. A warm room, a low light, a long story, and the slow unclenching of the hands. Now the story turns west, toward the sea, and toward the small quarrelsome people on the far shore of it, who are going to give this enormous empire more trouble than all its other frontiers put together, and who are also, by an accident of history, going to write the version of this story that the world would read for the next 2,000 years. The Greeks were not, in the Persian view of things, very important. Seen from Susa, they were the far edge of the western tax rolls, a scatter of small cities on poor stony land, ingenious, restless, famously for hire, forever at each other's throats. Many of them, remember, already lived comfortably inside the empire, the Greek cities of the Anatolian coast, Ionia, which had passed to Persia with the fall of Lydia, and which paid their tribute and sailed their ships and built their philosophy, because it was exactly there, inside the Persian Empire, in Miletus under the king's peace, that men like Thales began asking what the world is made of, and it is one of the small, delicious footnotes of history that what we call the birth of Greek philosophy happened. Administratively speaking, on Persian soil in the reign of Cyrus and his sons, but in the year 499 before the birth of Christ, Ionia rose. The revolt began, Herodotus cheerfully admits, not with a cry for freedom, but with a local schemer trying to stay ahead of his own debts, and it drew in 2 cities from the far shore. Athens, young in her democracy and nervous about Persia, sent 20 ships, and little Eretria sent 5. and the allied raiders marched inland and burned Sardis, the old Lydian capital, seat of a Persian satrap, and in the fire a temple of the local goddess burned with the rest. The revolt itself took the empire 6 years to grind out, ending with the fall of Miletus, and by the ordinary arithmetic of empires that should have been that, a frontier disturbance, handled, but the 20 ships lodged in Darius's mind. The story goes, and even if it was invented by someone who understood kings, that Darius asked who these Athenians were, and having been told, took his bow, shot an arrow into the sky, prayed to be granted vengeance on them, and ordered a servant to say to him 3 times, every day, at dinner, Master, remember the Athenians. Remember the Athenians. It has become a proverb, and you will notice that it worked rather better than intended. The king was made to remember Athens every day, and in the end it was history that could never again forget it. The first expedition Darius sent went north around the sea, and was wrecked by storms off the holy mountain of Athos. The second, in the year 490, went straight across the water, island to island, took Eretria in a week, and burned it in receipt for Sardis, and then put ashore, on the advice of an exiled Athenian tyrant travelling with the fleet. On a small curved plain by the sea about 26 miles from Athens, a plain fringed with marsh and famous for its fennel, which in Greek is called Marathon. What happened on that plain has been retold so many times and lit so brightly by everything that came after that we should lower the lights and simply watch. The Athenians came out, about 10,000 armoured farmers, and sat in the hills at the plain's edge for days, watching the Persian fires below, waiting for Spartan help that was delayed, the Spartans said, by a religious festival, which was probably even true. And then, on the morning when the moment came, the Athenian line did the thing the Persians did not expect. It ran, a mile of bronze coming down across the open ground at a trot, and then a run, thin in the centre and heavy on the wings, and the wings folded in like a closing door, and by the time the sun was high, the Persian force was pushing back to its ships through the marsh, and the sea gate of the plain was full of struggling men, and the ships pulled off with heavy loss, and the plain belonged to the farmers. The Persians, it must be said clearly here in the dark, did not regard this as the end of the world, because it was not. An expeditionary force had failed at the far western rim of an empire that stretched to India, roughly as if a raid had gone wrong at the edge of the map, and the imperial records, so careful about sheep and wages, do not appear to have found Marathon worth a tablet. But in Athens, everything changed. The men who fell were buried under a mound that still rises from that plain tonight, grassed and quiet beside the modern road, and the city understood, with a shock like cold water, that the empire of the age could be met in the field, and refused. And the runner of legend carried the news those 26 miles to the city, and died of the carrying. And 25 centuries later, whenever anyone anywhere laces their shoes and runs a marathon, they are, whether they know it or not, commemorating a morning in the Persian Wars, which is a strange and rather wonderful afterlife for a beach in Attica. Darius began preparing a third, far greater expedition, and then the years did what the Greeks could not. Egypt revolted. The court turned to that. And in 486 before the birth of Christ, Darius the shopkeeper, the organizer, the second founder, died in his bed after 36 years of running the world, and was carried to a tomb he had already cut for himself, high in a cliff face near Persepolis, at a place now called Naxirostam, where his cross-shaped doorway looks out over the plain, beside those of 3 of his successors, and above the door the old king had carved his own summary, and it is worth hearing, because so few epitaphs in history were dictated by their subjects, and fewer still ring true. I am Darius, the great king, king of kings, king of countries containing all kinds of men. By the favour of Ahura Mazda I am of such a sort that I am a friend to right, I am not a friend to wrong. It is not my desire that the weak man should have wrong done to him by the mighty. What is right, that is my desire. Whether it was always true is not the point of an epitaph. It is what he wished measured against him, and by the lights of the age that wish alone sets him apart. The son who climbed to the throne passed several brothers, smoothed on his way by being the first son born after his father became king, and by having Cyrus for a grandfather through his mother Atossa, was named Kshiasha, which the Greeks ground down into Xerxes, and with him the story arrives at its most famous chapter, the one the world has heard even when it has heard nothing else about Persia. And precisely because the world has mostly heard it as a shout, from the Greek side, with the Persians as a faceless flood, we are going to walk through it slowly, at night pace, seeing it, as far as we can, from both shores at once. Xerxes was in his mid-30s, tall, by every account imposing, the fourth king of the line, raised entirely inside the finished palace world his father had built. And he inherited the Athenian file along with everything else. He put down the Egyptian revolt first, and then Babylon stirred and was settled, harder this time. And then, with the empire quiet behind him, he turned to the west, and he did not plan a raid. He planned a full imperial expedition, king in person, army and fleet together, the whole weight of Asia laid deliberately on the scales. And the preparations alone took 4 years, and were themselves a kind of exhibition of what the empire was, because this time there would be no gamble on open water. The army would walk around the top of the Aegean, and the fleet would shadow it along the coast, and to make that possible the engineers went ahead, and the 2 things they built have never stopped astonishing. At the Hellespont, the narrow saltwater strait that separates Asia from Europe, where the current runs hard and the width is most of a mile, they built 2 bridges of boats, 674 ships and galleys anchored side by side in 2 long lines, bound together by 6 great cables of flax and papyrus, with a roadway of planks and packed earth laid across their decks, and brushwood screens along the sides, so that the horses and the camels would not see the water and take fright. And when a storm broke the first pair of bridges, the story says Xerxes had the sea itself given 300 lashes, and a set of fetters thrown into it for insolence, which the Greeks told forever after as the perfect picture of Eastern madness. A man whipping the ocean. Though one may quietly suspect the theatre was for the army's benefit, because nothing steadies frightened soldiers like a king, who acts as if even the sea reports to him. And at Athos, the holy headland where the first fleet had drowned in the storms years before, he simply removed the problem, cutting a ship canal 1.5 miles long clean through the neck of the peninsula, wide enough for 2 war galleys abreast. And the trace of that canal is still there tonight, a soft green depression across the fields, visible from the air, the signature of a man who, told that a mountain was in the way, had the mountain edited. In the spring of 480 before the birth of Christ, the army crossed the bridges, and it took 7 days and 7 nights marching continuously to pass from Asia into Europe. Herodotus, doing arithmetic that historians have been gently correcting ever since, counted the whole moving world of it at more than 2 million souls, and though the real fighting strength was perhaps 1/10 of that, still nothing remotely so large had ever moved anywhere before. Tens of thousands of soldiers from 46 nations, Persians and Medes at the core in their soft caps and scale shirts, Bactrians and Indians and Ethiopians, Arabs on camels, and behind and around the fighting men, the enormous slow tail of it all. Grooms and bakers and armourers, herds of remounts, wagons of the royal tents, the archive, the ice, and one may as well say it plainly, the empire itself, out for a walk. A man standing on a hill by the Hellespont that week, and Herodotus imagines exactly such a man, would have seen the straits floored with ships and the land dark with men to both horizons, and the story goes that Xerxes himself, reviewing all of it from a white stone throne on a headland, first pronounced himself happy, and then a moment later was seen to weep, and when his uncle asked why, he said, "Because it came to me that of all this multitude, not one man will be alive in 100 years. It is the most human sentence anyone in this whole war is recorded as saying, and it was said, notice, by the invader, at the height of his power, which is worth a slow thought as you lie there, that the man history dressed as the arrogant god-king was the one who looked at the largest army on earth and saw, for a heartbeat, only its mortality. And then, being a king with a schedule, dried his eyes and gave the order to march, which is more or less what every human being does every morning, on a smaller scale. Northern Greece, sensibly, submitted as the flood approached, city after city offering the tokens of earth and water. The line that meant to fight formed further south, and the first stand was set where the mountains come down almost to the sea and the coast road narrows to a strip a few yards wide between cliff and water. A place of hot springs called the Hot Gates, Thermopylae. What happened there is perhaps the most famous small battle in the history of the world, and the bones of it are simply told. A Greek advance force of a few thousand held the narrows, with the 300 Spartans of King Leonidas as its spine, and for 2 days the narrowness of the ground did what it was chosen to do. The empire's numbers could not deploy, and its attacks broke on the locked shields and the long spears in that corridor, and even the immortals were sent in and came back diminished, and Xerxes, watching from his throne, is said to have leapt to his feet 3 times in fear for his army. And then a local man, whose name the Greeks preserved with a curse, Ephialtes, told the king of a goat path over the mountain, and the immortals walked it in the dark through the oak woods, and by morning they were behind the pass, and Leonidas, learning it, sent the bulk of the allies away and stayed with his Spartans and a few others, the men of Thespiae choosing to stand with them, and they came out into the wide part of the pass, and fought there until the spears broke, and then with swords and, the historian says, when the swords broke, with hands and teeth, until the arrows finished it, and the pass was open, and the road to Athens lay bare. The Greeks made of that morning a hymn to freedom that has never stopped sounding, and the plain stone at the place says simply, "Stranger, tell the Spartans that we lie here," obedient to their word, and none of that is ours to diminish. But tonight, from the height we are watching from, we can afford to see the whole field, and the whole field includes the men coming the other way, because the soldiers who fell in thousands in that corridor, Medes and Scythians and Persians whose names no poet kept, were also somebody's sons, levied farmers and herdsmen from valleys a 4-month march away, obedient to their own word, dying at the edge of the map for a quarrel not 1 in 100 of them could have explained. And the hot springs steamed over all of them alike. And if there is a lesson at Thermopylae for the middle of the night, it is perhaps only this gentle one, that courage was never the private property of either shore of that sea. The army came south, and Athens could not be held, and here the Athenians did the extraordinary thing that actually won the war more than any single battle. They left the whole city on the advice of Themistocles, that cunning, far-sighted, not entirely honest man, whom we will meet again in a stranger place, boarded ships, the old and the young and the household gods carried down to the shore, and the population was ferried to the islands, and the fleet stood off. And when the empire arrived, it took possession of an empty stage. And the handful who had barricaded the sacred rock of the Acropolis were overcome, and the temples of the Acropolis burned, in plain sight of the fleet, in receipt, said the Persians, for Sardis and the Athenians on the crowded decks watched the glow of their own city in the night sky, and did not sail away, which is the fact on which everything after balances. What followed, in the strait between the mainland and the island of Salamis where the refugee fleet lay, was less a chess move than a piece of theatre staged by Themistocles, who sent a secret message to Xerxes, claiming the Greeks meant to slip away at night, advising the king to close the exits and catch them, and Xerxes, wanting the war finished before winter, believed it, and ordered his hundreds of ships into the narrow water, rowing all night to seal the channels, so that dawn found the great imperial fleet crowded into a strait where its numbers could not turn or manoeuvre, funnelled exactly as the army had been funnelled at Thermopylae, but this time it was the trap itself, and the Greek ships came out in the morning light, heavier, in home water. And the strait became a grinding wreckage of oars and bronze rams and swimming men, and by evening the imperial fleet had lost hundreds of ships in the sea, and Xerxes watched all of it, powerless, from a throne set on the hillside above the shore, which is its own strange picture. The master of the world in his silk canopy watching the water refuse him, and among his captains that day was a woman, Artemisia, Queen of Halicarnassus, commanding her own squadron, the only woman commander on either sea that morning, who fought hard and escaped the ruin by her wits, and whom Xerxes honoured afterward above his admirals, saying, the story goes, that his men had become women and his women men. And it says something pleasing about the empire of all nations, that the one commander to come out of Salamis with her reputation improved was a Carian queen. Salamis did not end the war, but it cut its supply line, because an army that size ate Greece bare in weeks and lived by its fleet, and winter was coming, and a king cannot sit at the far end of the earth forever while an empire waits. So Xerxes did the strategically sensible, unpoetic thing. He took the bulk of the army and went home, leaving a picked force under his best general, Mardonius. To finish the matter the following year, and the following year on the plain of Plataea, in the largest land battle Greece had ever seen, the thing was finished. But the other way, Mardonius fell, the camp was taken, and on the same day, tradition insists, across the sea at Mycale, the last of the fleet was burned on its beach, and the great invasion was over. And Greece, poor, marginal, impossible Greece, was free, and knew it, and never afterward stopped telling the world about it, and that telling, the plays and the histories and the marble, became the West's founding story of itself, liberty against the giant. And the giant in the story was Persia. And that is how the gentlest empire of the ancient world came down to modern imaginations, mostly as the villain of someone else's epic. Which is not exactly unjust. Invasions are invasions, but it is not the whole truth either, and tonight of all nights we can hold the whole of it. The courage on the beaches and the weeping king on the white throne both true at once, the way most large things are. Xerxes went home to his palaces, and the empire, and this is the part the epic never mentions, was fine. The war that fills the entire Greek historical imagination was, in the imperial ledgers, a failed frontier expedition, expensive, embarrassing, survivable. The western rim of the map settled back roughly where it had been before Lydia fell, and the king turned, as kings of finished empires do, to building, completing at Persepolis the gate of all nations, and the long stairways and his fathers, unfinished halls, and to the pleasures and poisons of a court at peace, and the historians who once painted the later Xerxes as a broken voluptuary sulking in his harem have been corrected by the stones themselves, which show a steady builder and a steady administration. But it is true that his story ends in the dark, because in the year 465 before the birth of Christ, the King of Kings was murdered in his bedchamber by the commander of his own bodyguard, a man named Artabanus, in a palace conspiracy whose exact springs no one will ever untangle. And a son, another Artaxerxes, came to the throne through the smoke of it, having perhaps first been made to believe, and perhaps knowing better, that his own brother was the killer. The empire, being an empire of procedure, absorbed even this, the way a great river absorbs a stone, and rolled on. And now, before we walk down the long, slow afternoon of the empire, let us step off the road of kings and battles altogether for a while, and spend some quiet time inside the great house itself, among the 101 ordinary evenings of the Persian peace. Because empires are not really made of battles. Battles are only the noises an empire makes at its edges, and the middle of it, the enormous quiet middle, was made of days, and the days were made of things like these. Morning in a village of the plateau, in the reign of Artaxerxes, say 24 centuries ago. The light comes up over the mountains the colour of apricots, and the first sound is water, the cold, ceaseless mutter of the Kanat stream arriving from its miles of darkness under the desert, sliding into the village pool, and the second sound is the morning doves, which sound exactly the same tonight in every village of Iran, the same falling 3-note call, which means that a Persian child waking then heard precisely what a child hears now, and that is a kind of time travel available to anyone with ears. Bread is going into the tandoor ovens, flat loaves slapped against the hot clay wall, and peeled off blistered and fragrant, and there is white cheese and there are dates, and in the orchard behind its mud wall the apricots are coming ripe, and the pomegranates are still small and green and hard as musket balls, and a man is up on the flat roof spreading the summer's first harvest of grapes to dry into raisins, and his daughter is driving the goats out along the lane, past the shrine where a juniper grows from a saint's grave, except that word saint is too late for this century, say rather a holy man, and the fire in the little fire temple on the hill has been fed its morning cedar by the priest whose family has fed it for 4 generations. Down the great road 2 miles away, the dust of a caravan is already standing in the air, wool and lapis and dried fish moving west, and the village pays it no attention at all. Caravans are weather here. And in the headman's house the tax assessment sits on its shelf, a small clay tablet, so much barley, so much wine, 1 mule for the post road, and it will be paid at harvest as it was paid last year, and no soldier will come, because no soldier needs to. That is what the king's peace looked like from below, and it covered on a given morning Egyptian fowlers netting ducks in the Nile marshes, and Babylonian clerks in the counting houses of the Temple of Marduk, filing contracts in cuneiform for barley futures. Because Babylon under the Persians ran a financial industry of startling sophistication, with family banking firms whose archives we have, loans, deposits, interest, mortgages, all of it ticking along on clay, and Ionian Greek stonemasons taking the king's wage at Susa, and Phoenician shipwrights in Sidon laying keels for the imperial fleet, and Jewish farmers on the upper Nile at Elephantine. Soldiers of a Persian garrison, writing home in Aramaic about weddings and lawsuits and a temple dispute, letters on papyrus that the desert kept for us, ordinary mail from the middle of the empire, and somewhere in Bactria a Zoroastrian priest chanting the old hymns at a dawn fire, and somewhere on the steppe frontier a customs man sealing a bale of hides, and all of these people, who would never meet, who shared no god, and no language, and no memory, were nevertheless inside one weather system of law and road and coin, and could, in principle, and sometimes in fact, travel from any of those mornings to any other, and be, the whole way, under the same roof. The language that Ruth spoke, by the way, was not Persian, which is a lovely imperial irony. It was Aramaic, the old merchant tongue of Syria, which the chancellery adopted because everyone along the roads already half knew it, and so the empire of the Persians ran its paperwork in the language of a small people it had conquered, almost in passing. And that choice had one enormous unintended consequence. It made Aramaic the common speech of the whole Near East for 1,000 years. Which is why, 5 centuries after our story, in a Roman province at the empire's old western edge, a carpenter's son in Galilee grew up speaking it, and the words he said on the cross were Aramaic words. Carried there, in the deep way that languages are carried, by Persian administrative convenience, and if you want a picture of how history actually works, that one will do as well as any. The greatest consequences forever sliding out of the smallest filing decisions while the battles get the paint. And we should talk for a moment about the women of this empire, because the Persepolis tablets already showed us the 4 women and the maternity rations, but the record goes further up. Persian royal women owned estates in their own names, whole villages and vineyards and workshops scattered across the provinces, and ran them through stewards as businesses, and the tablets show the Queen Mother and the king's wives ordering rations, employing hundreds of workers, travelling with their own households on their own passes, sealing their own documents with their own seals. And one woman, Irdabama, apparently a lady of the royal circle in the time of Darius, commanded a workforce of hundreds across several towns, an industrialist by any reasonable definition, 25 centuries before the word, and Greek writers, peering in from a world where a respectable woman scarcely left the house, found the visibility of Persian women scandalous and said so at length. And when a Greek calls your civilization decadent because its women own property and travel, you may at this distance wear the insult as a small quiet medal. The empire fed its poor better than most, too, because the crown stored grain against famine, and the price of not doing so was written into the royal prayers themselves. Protect this land from the enemy, from famine, and from the lie. That trinity of disasters, invasion, hunger, deceit, and it is worth noticing what a government reveals by what it prays against. Meanwhile, the sciences of the empire were mostly practical, and mostly borrowed and mostly improved, which is the imperial style. Babylonian astronomers within the Persian peace compiled the centuries of nightly observations, eclipses and planet risings pressed into clay, that would eventually teach the Greeks mathematical astronomy, so that when, long after, Greek science lit its famous lamp, a good part of the oil in it was pressed under Persian rule, and the doctors of Egypt and the engineers of Phoenicia and the surveyors of Mesopotamia all worked inside one system that moved knowledge along its roads as briskly as it moved wool, and the empire itself contributed the master sciences of the large, logistics, standardization, the audit, the census, the relay, the reservoir, the sciences of keeping enormous things alive, which no one had ever needed before because nothing so enormous had ever lived. And in the evenings, in the palaces and the caravanserais and the villagers alike, there were the stories. Because the Iranian peoples were storytellers above almost everything, and though the great written flowering would come much later, the deep roots of it lie in these centuries, the legends of primordial kings and dragon slayers, of the hero with the ox-headed mace, of the bird of ages nesting on the world mountain, tales that would be carried orally down 1,000 years and gathered at last, long after our story ends, into the Book of Kings, the Shahnameh, 60,000 couplets of them, which Iranians still recite tonight, in tea-houses from memory, and grandmothers in Shiraz still begin stories the way their ancestors began them under the Achaemenids, with a formula older than Persepolis. Yeki bud, yeki nabud, they say. Once there was, and once there was not. Which is, I think, the most perfect opening any storytelling tradition ever devised, and a fair description of everything in this world, empires very much included, and a good phrase to let dissolve on your tongue as you sink a little deeper into the pillow. Once there was, and once there was not. Everything in this story was exactly that. The bridges of boats were, and are not. The archers of the guard were, and are not. The gardens were, and here and there, in the watered courtyards of Shiraz and Isfahan, still are, and the doves still call in them at dawn. The empire looked outward too, in ways that its warlike reputation has hidden, because Darius the shopkeeper was also, quietly, one of history's great sponsors of exploration, on the sensible imperial grounds that you cannot tax what you have not mapped. When his armies reached the Indus Valley, the king did not simply add the province to the rolls, he ordered a reconnaissance of the water road home, and a captain from the Greek cities, Scylax of Carianda, was commissioned to build ships on the Indus, far up in the Punjab, and sail down the whole enormous river to the ocean, and then west along the coasts of Persia and Arabia. Around the peninsula, up the Red Sea to Egypt, a voyage of 30 months through waters no chart described, and Scylax made it, and wrote the first known account of India that the Western world ever possessed, the grandfather of every book about India written since, and the sea road he proved joined, in the king's mind, with the canal his diggers were finishing between the Nile and the Red Sea, into a single breathtaking thought that a ship might load in the Indus Delta and unload in the Mediterranean, all within the king's peace, the dream of Suez and the dream of the India trade. Both dreamed at Susa 500 years before the birth of Christ, and both, in time, both realized. Though the realizing took the world 24 centuries and the empire did not live to collect the tolls. There were stranger voyages still. Herodotus tells of a Persian nobleman, Cyrus, condemned to death for a crime, and offered by Xerxes a commutation more terrible than the sentence, to sail around the whole of Africa, which the Persians had heard from the Phoenicians was possible, and Cyrus took a ship and cruise from Egypt and passed the Pillars of Hercules and beat south down the endless Atlantic coast of the continent for months until, somewhere in the doldrums off the western bulge, the ship, he said, simply stopped, would sail no further, as if the sea itself declined, and he turned back, and Xerxes, unimpressed by tales of small men on far beaches, carried out the original sentence, which is a hard ending, but the story it leaves behind is a marvel, a Persian ship's company, 5 centuries before Christ. Standing off the green, unknown coast of West Africa, seeing what no one from the civilized East had ever seen, and the fact that we know their captain's name at all, across all that water and all that time, is its own quiet miracle of the roads of memory. And while the captains mapped the edges, the engineers kept enlarging the middle, and one of their works deserves a slow minute of the night, the paradise of engineering that was the Empire's water law. In the dry heart provinces, the crown ruled that any man who brought new water to waterless land by digging a kanat should hold that land, and its water, tax lightened, for generations of his line. And the result was a slow green explosion, hundreds and then thousands of those patient tunnels inching back into the alluvial fans of the mountains, dug by hand by lamplight. By specialist guilds of diggers, the mucanis, fathers and sons, who read the buried water by the colour of dawn mist and the taste of well mud, who worked in the cool dark on their knees with a short pick and a leather bucket, and who reckoned among themselves, it is said, that of all deaths a man could die, the tunnel asked only that you listen to it. And the tunnels are perhaps the most honest monument the Empire has, because Persepolis was built in decades and burned in a night, and the kanats were dug over centuries and many a running still. And if you want to know which of a civilization's works will last, the rule the plateau teaches is gentle and absolute. The works of display die young, and the works of patience outlive everything, which is not a bad rule to fall asleep on, in an age as fond of display as ours. The army, too, was mostly not the monster of the Greek imagination, but another department of the great administration, and its daily reality, visible in the ration tablets, was bread and onions and beer and route marches and equipment inspections, the eternal unchanging life of soldiers, and its heart, the 10,000 of the Royal Guard, the so-called immortals, lived better than most, marching. The Greeks noted with fascinated disapproval, with their own wagons of women and servants, and their rations served on silver, and the guardsmen's spears, as we saw, bore golden apples at the butt, and the king's own bodyguard within the guard were the apple-bearers, and it is pleasing to imagine the recruiting sergeants of Susa explaining to a farm boy from Fars that if he kept his kit clean and his rank straight he might one day carry an apple of solid gold, and more pleasing still to know, from the tablets, that his mother back in the village could draw his allotment of grain while he served, because the Empire, whatever else it was the kind of machine that remembered the soldier's mother, and machines that remember mothers tend, on the whole, to be obeyed. One more domestic wonder, and then the afternoon of the kings is waiting for us. The Persians, Herodotus says, in one of the most quoted sentences of his whole enormous book, deliberate on their weightiest matters twice, once sober and once drunk, and whatever they decide drunk they reconsider sober, and whatever they decide sober they reconsider drunk. And only what passes both examinations is done, and the Greeks told this as a joke, and it has been retold as a joke for 2,400 years. And it is not a joke, it is committee procedure of a very high order, an institutional guard against both timidity and folly, the sober mind checking the bold mind checking the cautious one, and any modern board of directors that adopted it honestly would probably make fewer and braver and better decisions, though the minutes of the second session would want careful drafting. And they held, Herodotus also says, that the most disgraceful thing in the world was to tell a lie, and the second most disgraceful was to owe a debt. Because, they said, the debtor is forced eventually to lie. And there, in one sentence of borrowed ethnography, is the whole Zoroastrian spine of the culture, the horror of the lie as the root of all other evils, the same horror that Darius carved at Behistun, where the rebellions he crushed are called. Every one, the lie, and the prayer we have already heard, asks protection from the enemy, from famine, and from the lie, as if falsehood were a weather system or an invading army, which, the old faith would answer calmly, is exactly what it is, and always has been, and the only walls that hold against it are the ones each person keeps. Good thoughts, good words, good deeds, patrolled nightly, like stations on a road. Since we are speaking of the faith, let us spend a few slow minutes with the men who kept it, because they are hiding, in plain sight, inside one of the most famous stories in the world, and hardly anyone notices them there. The priests of the western Iranian lands were a hereditary tribe, or caste, called the Magi, the Magush in the old tongue, and they were the ritual specialists of the empire, the keepers of the fires, the singers of the ancient hymns, the interpreters of dreams and omens, present at every sacrifice, chanting, the Greeks tell us, the theogony in a low continuous voice while the offering was made. And they were also, in the eyes of the peoples of the empire and then of the Greeks and then of everyone, the very type and image of the Eastern wise man, the possessor of strange knowledge, and their name travelled even further than their fires. Because what the Magi did, in Greek, was mageia, and mageia became magic, so that every magician in every children's book tonight, every stage conjurer pulling a rabbit from a hat, every wizard in every story read aloud at bedtime, carries in his job title the name of the Persian priesthood, which would have scandalized them, and there is more. Because the Magi were watchers of the sky, keepers of the old Babylonian star wisdom that the empire had inherited, readers of risings and settings and wandering stars, and when, 5 centuries after Darius, a Greek-speaking Jewish writer in the Roman East, wanted to tell of a newborn king so significant that the very heavens announced him, and asked himself who, in all the furniture of the world's imagination, would be the ones to read such an announcement and act on it. The answer was obvious, and so he wrote, "Behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem," saying, "We have seen his star," and the word he wrote for wise men was magoi, magi, Persian priests, and that is who the 3 kings of every Christmas carol and every children's nativity play actually are, following their star across the December dark with their gold and frankincense and myrrh, the priesthood of the Persian Empire, walking forever westward through the world's best-loved story. And no one in the pageant, least of all the 8-year-olds in the paper crowns, has any idea that they are dressed as officials of the Achaemenid state religion, and now you do. And it is yours to smile over quietly at the next nativity play you attend. The faith the Magi served had at its heart a picture of what happens after death that was unlike anything else in the ancient world, and gentler in its final architecture than most of what came later, and it is worth unfolding here in the dark, not as doctrine but as a picture, the way one unfolds any old and beautiful map. The soul, the teaching went, lingers near the body for 3 nights, and on the 4th dawn sets out, and comes to a crossing, the Chinvat Bridge, the bridge of the separator, which spans the gulf between this world and the other, and as the soul steps onto the bridge, it is met by a figure coming the other way, a young woman. And to the soul that has kept faith with the light she is radiant, more beautiful than anything seen in life, and the soul asks, "Who are you?" And she answers, "I am yourself. I am your own thoughts, your own words, your own deeds, walking to meet you." And for such a soul the bridge is broad as a highway, and leads up into the house of song. And for the soul that fed the lie, the same figure comes, and is otherwise, and the bridge is otherwise, narrow as a blade. And what waits below is not eternal, notice. Even there the old faith is unlike its stern descendants, because at the end of all things, the teaching insisted, the renovation would come, the world would be made fresh, the metal of the mountains would flow molten across the earth, and to the just it would feel. The texts say, like walking through warm milk. And every soul, at the last, every single one, would come through and be well, and the darkness would simply end, not defeated in some final screaming battle, so much as outlasted. The way night is outlasted, by the patient arriving of the light, and whatever one believes or does not believe at this hour of the evening, you must admit it is a restful eschatology, a universe whose final chapter is not a courtroom but a sunrise, and whose deepest judge on the bridge is nothing more and nothing less than the person you have been, walking toward you with your own face. Their daily ethics were of a piece with it, and touchingly practical. To dig a channel and bring water to dry land was, the tradition held, a work of positive holiness, and to plant a tree likewise, and the texts rank the places where the earth rejoices, and high among them is wherever a righteous man builds a house with a fire and a wife and children and good herds, and where the fields are made to flourish, which is to say that the old faith of the plateau located sanctity not in renunciation, not in the desert cell, but in the watered garden and the working farm and the lit hearth, in increase and tending and the keeping of small living things, and a religion whose idea of a holy place is a well-run family farm with a fire burning in the kitchen, is a religion that has understood something. Whatever its rivals said, and the empire it blessed, was, at its best, that farm at world scale, watered, tended, lit and audited. Even their famous care for truthful speech reached down into the schoolroom, for Herodotus reports in another of his much-loved sentences that the sons of the Persians were taught, from the age of 5 to the age of 20, 3 things only: to ride, to shoot the bow, and to speak the truth, and scholars have enjoyed pointing out that this is certainly too simple, that the tablets show scribes and accountants in training, languages and law and the abacus, and the scholars are right, and yet the sentence has survived every correction, because it names the ideal underneath the curriculum, and because as a summary of what one generation owes the next it has hardly been improved. Competence, courage, honesty, sit straight, aim well, do not lie, and 25 centuries of educational theory have mostly been footnotes to that, wearing progressively more complicated hats. The long afternoon of the empire, the century and a bit between Xerxes and the end, is the stretch that the history books usually hurry over because it has no marathon in it, and hurrying is exactly what we will not do. Though we can be gentle and unhurried and still honest about what kind of light this is, it is afternoon light, long and golden and very slowly declining. Artaxerxes I, who came to the throne through his father's murder, reigned for 40 years, and the Greeks called him Longhand, because his right hand was said to be longer than his left, and history remembers him mostly for a single marvellous irony. Because it was to his court that Themistocles came, Themistocles the victor of Salamis, the very man who had tricked the imperial fleet to its ruin, hounded out of Athens a decade later by his own grateful countrymen, as democracies do. Ostracised, chased across the Aegean with a price on his head, and the great trickster went east to the only power large enough to shelter him, and stood before the son of the king he had defeated. And the king, the story says, was delighted, woke in the night crying out with pleasure that he had Themistocles the Athenian, and gave him 3 cities in Anatolia for his bread and his wine and his fish. And the victor of Salamis lived out his days a Persian governor, comfortable, useful and quietly employed advising on Greek affairs. And if you want a single anecdote that contains everything about both civilizations, the Greek genius for producing extraordinary men and the Greek genius for exiling them, the Persian genius for absorbing anyone useful whatever their file said, that is the anecdote, and both sides would have agreed it proved their superiority, and both would have been right. The same reign made formal peace with Athens at last, and the empire settled back to tend its enormous garden, and what trouble there was came now in a repeating pattern. And we may as well name the pattern honestly, because the empire never solved it. Egypt, the oldest, proudest, least digestible of the provinces, rose again and again, decade after decade, and was retaken again and again at ruinous cost, and for one long stretch of 60 years was effectively gone altogether, a breakaway kingdom under native pharaohs, until almost the very end of our story. Satraps in the far west, commanding armies a 3-month march from the court, discovered that they could conduct their own foreign policy, and sometimes their own rebellions, and were put down, or bought off, or died conveniently, and the court itself, wealthy beyond imagining and structurally awash in half-brothers, princes of the harem, and ambitious grandees, developed the elaborate deadly indoor politics that afflicts every long-lived monarchy, the eunuch chamberlains, the queen mothers with long memories, the poisoned cup, the smothered air. The Greek doctor Ctesias, who served at that court and wrote it up with a gossip's relish, hands us a gallery of palace horrors that reads like grim opera, and much of it is surely embroidered. But the drumbeat of it is real enough, and it tells you where the empire's danger had moved. The danger was no longer at the frontiers, it was in the corridor outside the bedchamber. And yet, and this must be said as clearly, the machine ran. Through all of it, the roads were kept, the tribute came, the tablets were filed, the harvests were stored, the fleet was built, and the empire in its so-called decline remained, by an enormous margin, the wealthiest and most powerful state on earth, so much so that during these very decades it discovered it could manage the Greeks without ever launching another ship against them, using a weapon lighter than bronze and infinitely more efficient. The Daric. Greek cities, it turned out, would fight each other indefinitely if someone else paid for the fleets, and someone else was delighted to, and when Athens and Sparta locked into their long suicidal war, Persian gold flowed discreetly to whichever side was losing, keeping the scales level and the Greeks busy, and in the end it was Persian subsidy that built the Spartan fleet which finally broke. Athens, so that the war the Greek historians present as the great tragedy of Hellas, was, from a window at Susa, a successfully outsourced frontier policy, and the empire got the Ionian cities of the coast signed back over to it afterward. By treaty, with Greek ambassadors doing the signing, everything Xerxes had marched 1,000,000 men for, obtained a lifetime later for cash. Without a single Persian soldier getting his feet wet, and whatever one thinks of the ethics, as pure statecraft it deserves a low respectful whistle in the dark. Once, in the middle of this period, the indoor politics and the outdoor world collided and produced an adventure so strange that it became one of the most read books of antiquity. When King Darius II died, his elder son took the throne as Artaxerxes II, and his younger son, Cyrus the Younger, satrap of the West, brilliant, charming and hungry, decided the throne should be his, and quietly hired what his gold could buy, which was more than 10,000 Greek mercenary infantry. Veterans of the long Greek War, told them they were marching against hill tribes, and led them instead all the way down the royal road, through Anatolia, across the Euphrates, into the heart of the empire, to within earshot of Babylon itself, where at a place called Cunaxa the brothers' armies met, and the Greek phalanx swept everything before it on its wing, and it made no difference at all, because Cyrus, charging at his brother in the melee with a javelin in his hand and the diadem within reach of it, was struck below the eye and died on the field, and 10,000 Greek professionals found themselves victorious, unemployed, and 2,000 miles from home, in the middle of somebody else's empire, with their generals shortly lured to a parley, and killed. What followed was the march of the 10,000, the long fighting retreat north through the snows of Armenia to the sea, told by one of the men who led it, an Athenian gentleman soldier named Xenophon, in a book every Greek schoolboy would read for centuries. And the moment when the starving column crested a ridge, and the men began to shout the sea, Thalata, Thalata, is one of the oldest thrills in all literature, and the book had one reader whose attention would matter terribly. Because what the story said to anyone reading it coldly was that a Greek army could march into the very middle of the Persian Empire, win its battle, lose everything, and still walk out alive, and in a schoolroom in Macedonia a generation later. That cold reading was being done by a boy with a famous tutor and a king for a father. But his hour is not quite yet. Let him wait in his schoolroom a little longer. The empire has one more good stretch of afternoon left, and we owe it the courtesy of not skipping ahead. Artaxerxes II reigned for 46 years, longer than any king of the line, patron of buildings, survivor of his terrifying mother, his ambitious wife, and several of his own sons, and his successor, the third Artaxerxes, was a harder and colder article altogether. A king with something of the old iron in him, who put down the rebellious satraps of the West with method, and then, in the last great achievement of the dynasty, did what 3 generations had failed to do. He took Egypt back, ending the 60-year succession, so that in the year 343 before the birth of Christ, a decade before the end of everything, the empire of Cyrus stood once more, and for the last time, complete. From the cataracts of the Nile to the Indus, and a dispassionate observer in that year, asked to name the permanent fixtures of the world, would have named the sun, the sea, and Persia, and would have been wrong within his own lifetime about only one of them, and lying awake worrying about none, which is its own quiet lesson that the future is the one province no empire ever held. The end of the dynasty's peace came from indoors, as it had long threatened to. A court eunuch and kingmaker named Bagoas poisoned Artaxerxes III, and then the heir, and finally reached for a cousin from a junior branch to serve as his next puppet, a tall, reportedly gentle, personally brave nobleman who took the throne named Darius, the third of it, and who surprised his patron by declining to be poisoned in his turn, feeding the fatal cup to Bagoas instead, and who then looked west, as every king of kings eventually looked west, and saw what all the king's eyes and all the king's ears had been reporting for 20 years, that the quarrelsome Greek cities had finally been quarrelled into order, not by each other, but from above, by the half-wild kingdom of Macedonia and its one-eyed soldier King Philip, who had built the finest army in the world and had it pointed east. And when Philip fell to an assassin's knife at a wedding, the army and the ambition and the throne passed together to his son, 20 years old, the boy from the schoolroom, Alexander. Before the armies crossed the water, let us stand still for a moment on the eve of it all, and look honestly at the empire as it was in the last years of its peace. Because the version of this story the world inherited from the Greek and Roman writers has a tidy moral shape, the soft old empire, rotted by luxury, waiting like an overripe fruit for the young hard hand, and tidy moral shapes should always be patted down for concealed weapons. The empire Darius III inherited was not a ruin. It was, on the books, richer than it had ever been, the treasuries at Susa and Persepolis stacked with 2 centuries of surplus, the tribute arriving, the satrapal system functioning from the Aegean to the Indus, the fleet, Phoenician and Cypriot and Egyptian, the largest on the sea, and its armies enormous, if slow to gather, and by no means contemptible. The heavy cavalry of Iran was as good as any mounted force on earth, and everyone who actually fought Persian troops, including the Macedonians, at every one of the coming battles, took losses that said so. Nor was it hated from within. In the way conquered worlds can be hated, there was no general rising to greet the invader, no oppressed 100 nations waiting for a liberator. And this matters, because it is the quiet refutation of the overripe fruit. The provinces mostly fought for the king, or waited, as provinces prudently do. And the cities that opened their gates to Alexander opened them for the oldest reason in the world, because the army in front of the walls had just beaten the army that was supposed to be between them, and there was, it must be said, a script for that on file, the same script Babylon had performed for Cyrus. Welcome the strong lawful seeming stranger, garland him, show him the temples. Present the accounts, and it is one of history's stranger compliments that the machinery Cyrus built for absorbing kingdoms worked so smoothly that at the end it absorbed his own successor's conqueror without a shudder. What the empire actually lacked in the fatal years can be counted on one hand, and none of the fingers is called decadence. It lacked luck. First, because within a 2-year span just before the storm, a run of deaths, natural and otherwise, had swept away the able King Artaxerxes III, his heir, and a whole senior generation of commanders, leaving a court still rearranging itself when the crossing came. It lacked, second, a military answer to one specific new instrument. The Macedonian phalanx with its 18-foot pikes, working in concert with shock cavalry, a system Philip had spent 20 obsessed years forging and which nothing east of the Aegean had faced. And empires, like all great settled firms, are slowest exactly where a lean newcomer is fastest, at retooling. It lacked, third in the person of its last king, that final, unteachable ingredient, the nerve that holds a field when the guard is dying around the chariot, and this is not cruelty to Darius III, who was by the accounts a decent, brave, physically imposing man, tested and adequate in every trial of his life, except the 2 afternoons on which the world happened to be decided, and who was facing, across the dust, the most gifted battlefield commander who has ever lived. An unfairness so total that blame dissolves into something more like weather, and one may as well blame a valley for the flood. And it lacked, fourth and deepest, time, because the truth the tidy moral shape hides is that the empire was not decaying, it was becoming. All through its so-called decline, the deep channels were still cutting themselves, Aramaic spreading, the roads thickening with trade, the mixed marriages and mixed garrisons and mixed gods of 200 years quietly manufacturing the very cosmopolitan world that Alexander would be praised for imagining. He did not invent the fusion of East and West. He inherited it, walked into it down the royal roads, married it at Susa. And the fairest single sentence anyone can say about the fall of Persia is that the empire had spent 2 centuries teaching the world how to be one enormous household, and then the pupil arrived, sword in hand, and was mistaken forever after for the teacher. Hold, too, before the bridges are laid again, the sheer ordinariness of the last quiet years. Because history's cameras only run when something is burning, and so we never see the empire's final peacetime evenings. But they happened, millions of them, in the middle 330s before the birth of Christ. A customs clerk at Sardis balancing his month and complaining, in Aramaic about the new forms, a wedding in Damascus under the pomegranate trees, the postmaster at some high cold station on the Ecbatana road, noting in his log a dispatch rider through at dusk, snow expected, horses sound, a Babylonian astronomer on his temple roof entering Jupiter's position in the diary as his grandfather had and his grandson would, or so he had every reason to assume. The fires fed, the gardens watered, the accounts sent up. The whole vast patient breathing of a world that did not know it was nearer, and would have been astonished and a little insulted to learn that thinkers 23 centuries later would describe it chiefly as a thing that was about to end. No world believes it is about to end. This one had less reason than most. It had lasted 200 years, longer than most empires ever manage. It had survived usurpation, plague, secession, and a dozen palace mornings after, and its citizens went to bed in the year 335 with the same reasonable confidence in tomorrow that you are entitled to feel tonight, and that is not dramatic irony at their expense. It is fellowship, because every settled, peaceful evening in the history of the world has been held in trust exactly that way, on reasonable confidence and nothing stronger, and the only sane response to that fact is not dread. It is the one the old Plateau faith recommended: gratitude for the lit hearth, attention to the day's small honest work, and sleep, which is where you are going, and the empire, which kept more evenings safe than almost any power of the ancient world, would be content, I think, to be remembered at last, not by the 2 afternoons it lost, but by the 70,000 quiet evenings it kept. And we will let that be its epitaph on the eve of the storm. And now, gently, let the spring of 334 come on. In the spring of 334 before the birth of Christ, Alexander crossed the Hellespont, over the same narrow water Xerxes had bridged with boats 146 years earlier, going the other way, and he crossed it with about 40,000 men, which is worth pausing on, because it was a small army, smaller than many a satrap's levy. And the empire he was invading could raise, given time, 40 times his numbers, and every sensible person on both shores of the Aegean knew how this story ended. Armies like his had come east before, and been swallowed like rivers in the salt desert. The sensible people were about to be given the great correction of their age. Alexander was 22, and he came on like weather. At the river Granicus, a few days' march inland, the satraps of the west met him with their cavalry massed on the steep far bank, and he did the thing no sensible commander does, went straight across the river into their faces, led the charge himself, wearing white plumes that made him a target visible to every man on the field, was struck so hard through the helmet that he was a sword's fall from ending the whole story right there, an arm's length from a nameless footnote, and was saved at the last half-second by his officer Clytus severing the striking arm, and by evening the western satrapies were, functionally, gone, and here, at the very first battle. We can already see both of the things that were true of Alexander in Persia, and they were true simultaneously the whole way, so hold both. He was a destroyer, and he was a suitor. The destroyer broke the armies of the empire. The suitor, almost from the first city, began behaving less like an invader and more like a claimant, confirming Persian officials in their posts. Leaving provincial structures standing, courting the loyalty of the very machine he was breaking. Because Alexander, tutored on Xenophon and on Cyrus's legend, was not coming to abolish the empire of the world. He was coming to sit in its chair. A year later, in a coastal pinch of country by the Gulf of Issus, he met not a satrap but the king, because Darius III had come out in person with a grand army, and had actually outmaneuvered Alexander, getting behind him, cutting his supply road, forcing the battle on ground of his choosing, and it went for nothing, because the ground of his choosing was narrow, sea on one side, hills on the other, the empire's numbers once again folded uselessly like a fan. And when the Macedonian cavalry broke through toward the royal standard, Darius, watching his guard die around his chariot, turned and fled the field, and with that turning, though years of fighting remained, something invisible and decisive broke, because the King of Kings had run, in sight of both armies, and left behind, in the captured camp, his treasure, his tent, and, almost unbelievably, his family, his mother, his wife, said to be the most beautiful woman in Asia, and his children. What followed the capture is one of those small scenes that decide how history feels about a man. Alexander treated the royal women, all the sources agree, with complete and scrupulous honour, housed them, guarded them, maintained their state, and the queen mother Sisygambis, taken from her fleeing son and given into the hands of the barbarian, formed over the years that followed an attachment to Alexander that the ancient writers describe without embarrassment as that of a mother. And hold on to her, because at the very end of Alexander's part of this story, Sisygambis, the mother of his enemy, is going to deliver wordlessly the single most devastating verdict on him that antiquity records, and it is a verdict of grief. Darius, regrouping east of the Euphrates, wrote offering ransom, then half the empire to the Euphrates, then his daughter in marriage with the West entire. Terms no Macedonian in the army could believe were being refused, and old General Parmenion said, famously, I would accept. If I were Alexander, and Alexander answered, so would I if I were Parmenion, which is either the most magnificent or the most insufferable sentence of the 4th century depending on your mood, and possibly both, and refused everything, and came on. He took his time doing it, which shows the cold method under the fire, 7 months breaking the island fortress of Tyre so that no Persian fleet could ever rise behind him, then Egypt, which fell without a blow and hailed him Pharaoh, the liberating stranger, son of a moon, and where he paced out on the coast the street lines of a city to be named for himself, Alexandria, which would carry Greek learning through the next 1,000 years, and then, in the autumn of 331, he crossed the 2 rivers and came out onto the wide plain of Gaugamela in northern Mesopotamia, where Darius was waiting with everything the empire had left, the levies of every remaining province, cavalry from the steppe to the Indus, 200 scythed chariots, war elephants, on ground the king had personally chosen and flattened, and this time there was no pinch of sea and hills, this time the fan could open fully, and the imperial line overlapped the Macedonian line by miles on both ends, and the night before Parmenion urged a night attack, and Alexander refused to steal his victory, and slept late, and in the morning played on that immense flattened board the masterpiece of his life, refusing his flank, dragging the Persian left wide and wider, until the moving masses tore a seam in their own centre, and then he turned and rode into the seam, with the companion cavalry in a wedge, straight at the royal standard, straight at Darius, exactly as at Issus, and exactly as at Issus. And now, finally and forever, the king turned his chariot and fled, and the grand army of the empire, leaderless at its heart, unbeaten on great stretches of its own line, dissolved into the dust it had raised, and the plain of Gaugamela decided, in an afternoon, the ownership of Western Asia. The doors swung open one after another now. Babylon surrendered in state, priests and officials streaming out with garlands, the streets carpeted with flowers, the ancient protocol of welcoming a lawful conqueror performed to the letter for the Macedonian, as it had been performed for Cyrus 208 years before, and Alexander, playing his part as Cyrus had, sacrificed to Marduk, and ordered temples restored. And Susa surrendered its palaces and a treasury beyond counting, and then, in midwinter, he forced the mountain passes of Fars against their last defenders, the one gallant, hopeless stand of the war, and came down at last into the home valley of the Persians, to the terrace under the Mount of Mercy, to the stair built for horses and the gate of all nations, to Persepolis. The ceremonial heart of the dynasty, thrown open with all its treasure, the accumulated tribute of 2 centuries, a sum the sources report in figures so vast they read like typographical errors. 120,000 talents, carried away, we are told, on 10,000 mule carts and 5,000 camels, and the army wintered there among the stone processions of the 23 nations, the guests of a house whose family was gone. And then, on a night in the spring of 330 before the birth of Christ, Persepolis burned. The accounts disagree about how it began, and the disagreement is itself the story. One version says it was policy, cold and deliberate, the announced retribution for the burning of Athens' temples 150 years before, the receipt for Xerxes finally presented. The other version, older and stranger, and told with too much circumstantial embarrassment to be pure invention, says it was a party, a drinking feast deep in the palace, flute girls and victory wine, and an Athenian woman named Tias crying out that it would be the best of all Greece's revenges for the women of the conquerors to burn the house of Xerxes with their own hands, and torches snatched up in the roar of it, and the king himself, flushed and laughing, leading the drunken procession through the halls with the flames going up behind them into the cedar roofs. The cedar of Lebanon that had crossed the empire on the king's roads, 70 feet up on the double bulls, burning, the roofs coming down through the night in avalanches of sparks over the Apadana, over the 100-column hall, over the carved nations still walking calmly up their stairway with their gifts. And the glow of it visible, that night, from every village on the plain of Fars, where the actual Persians, the herdsmen and orchard keepers whose ancestors had followed Cyrus, stood in their doorways in the dark and watched the heart of their world burn down. Several sources add that Alexander, sober in the morning light with the smoke still rising, regretted it, and I believe the regret, not out of charity to him, but because we have met this man now, and the fire made no sense for the king of Asia he intended to be. He had burned his own new house, and because of what we found in the ash, remember, it was the burning that buried and fired and preserved the archive tablets, so that the rationalists of the workmen and the 4 women and the couriers survived precisely because the palace above them died. The ledger saved by the burning of the boast, and history does not often hand you its ironies as neatly as that. Darius III was in the north, at Ecbatana, still king in name, gathering what would not gather, and when Alexander came on in the spring the last court fled east along the road toward Bactria, shedding loyalty as it went, until the great nobles travelling with the king, led by the satrap Bessus, a kinsman of the royal house, decided the cause needed a more useful king, and arrested Darius, and carried him along in a closed wagon in chains that one account, unable to stop being Persian even at the end of the world, says were golden chains, and when Alexander's pursuit, riding through 2 nights, closed the last miles. The conspirators stabbed the king and left him by the road and scattered. A Macedonian trooper found the wagon by a spring. The tradition, and let it be true tonight, whatever the sober historians mutter, says Darius was dying and asked for water, and drank, and said that it was his final misfortune to be unable to repay a kindness, and sent, with the last of his voice, his thanks to Alexander for the honour shown to his mother and his wife and his children, and put his hand in the soldier's hand, and died, the 13th king of kings of the house of Achaemenes, in the dust at the side of the road, attended at the end by one enemy soldier with a helmet full of water. When Alexander came up, he laid his own cloak over the body, and this is the point where the story performs its last and strangest turn, because from that roadside forward, Alexander is no longer, in any simple sense, the enemy of this dynasty. He is its executor, and very nearly its heir. He sent the body of Darius south in state to the Queen Mother to be buried with royal honours among the kings. He hunted down Bessus, who had crowned himself, And when he caught him, he did not treat him as a rival conqueror treats a rival. He treated him as a Persian king treats a regicide, tried and mutilated and executed by Persian law, before Persian judges, avenging, please notice, the king he himself had dethroned. He began wearing elements of Persian royal dress, the diadem, the striped tunic, to the mounting fury of his own veterans, appointed Persians to satrapies and commands, enrolled 30,000 Persian boys to be trained in the Macedonian fashion, tried to introduce the Persian court bow, which nearly caused a mutiny among men who bowed to gods only, and at Susa, in a single festival, married the eldest daughter of Darius himself, and married 90 of his officers to the daughters of the Persian nobility, 10,000 of his soldiers to Asian wives, one deliberate massive weaving together of conqueror, and conquered into a single ruling people, his own two hands, Macedonia and Persia, clasped. And whether that vision was statesmanship of a reach no one had dared before, or vanity dressed as brotherhood, the old empire's answer was, in a way we can almost admire, procedural. The machines simply absorbed him, the satrapies administered him, the roads carried him, the protocols closed over him the way the river closes over a stone, and the last Achaemenid, some modern historian has dryly remarked, was a Macedonian. He went east for years, to Bactria and Sogdiana and over the mountains into India, to the edge of the maps and past it, and it was his own Macedonians, at last, on a monsoon riverbank, who refused to walk 1 mile further into the endless world. And he came back through the southern deserts at terrible cost, and at Pasargadae, as we saw, he found Cyrus's tomb violated in the wartime chaos, and restored it, the new king kneeling in the doorway, so to speak, of the first one, and then in Babylon, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, in the first June heat of the year 323 before the birth of Christ, 10 years almost to the season since he had crossed the Hellespont, Alexander took a fever after a long banquet. And for 10 days the army bulletin said the king was resting, the king was better, and then the veterans forced the doors and filed past his bed in silence, hundreds and hundreds of scarred men shuffling by while he, past speech, moved his eyes and lifted his fingers to them. And on the 10th or 11th day, in the afternoon, aged 32, king of Macedonia, hegemon of Greece, pharaoh of Egypt, lord of Asia, king of kings, he died, and the world he left, having been given no instructions, or one instruction, to the strongest, tore itself apart among his generals for 40 years. And in the old capital, when the news came, the court observed the passing of a king of kings with the full ancient forms, and the queen mother Sisigambis, who had lost her son the king to this man, and then, unimaginably, come to love him as a son in her son's place, was told that Alexander was dead, and she turned her face to the wall, the historians record, and refused all food and all light, and on the 5th day she died, of grief, freely chosen, the mother of Darius mourning herself to death for the man who had unmade her house. And if you want to know what Alexander was, after all the arguments of all the biographers, there it is, both halves of it at once and inseparable, the destruction and the love held in a single old woman's silence, and no one in 23 centuries has put it better than she did by saying nothing at all. So the dynasty was gone, and the story ought to be over. And here is the quiet wonder we have been walking toward all night. It was not over. Because dynasties are only the visible part of a civilization, the part that fits on coins, and the invisible part, the language, the faith, the gardens, the roads, the way of doing things and seeing things, went on living underneath the new masters, like the water in the Kanats, out of sight and still flowing. The generals' wars settled at last into a map, and the Asian bulk of the old empire fell to the descendants of Alexander's general Seleucus, Greek-speaking kings ruling from new Greek cities over the same old provinces, with the same satrapal bones under the new names, collecting the same taxes along the same roads, and Greek became the language of the cities and the harbours. And for a century and a half it may have looked, from a harbour, as if Asia was becoming Greek. Asia was doing what Asia had always done, absorbing. Out on the northeastern grass, among Iranian-speaking horse peoples who had never much noticed who claimed to rule them, a tribe called the Parni rode south into the province of Parthia and took its name, and grew, patiently, kingdom by kingdom, until the Parthian Empire of the Arsacid kings had gathered back almost the whole Iranian world from the Euphrates to the east, horse lords again. With their heavy armoured knights and their famous backward-shooting Parthian shot, and they called themselves, on their coins, Philhellene, friends of the Greeks, and then, increasingly, they called themselves something older, King of Kings, and when Rome, the new giant of the West, came east assuming it would do to Parthia what it did to everyone. Rome met at Carrhae one of the worst days in its military history, and learned to treat the Iranian power as the one neighbour on earth it could not digest, and for 700 years, first under the Parthians and then under their successors, the standoff of Rome and Persia was simply the permanent architecture of the Western world. 2 empires, 2 suns, as their own diplomats put it, and everything from Syria to Armenia lived in the light and shadow of the pair of them. The successors were the Sasanians, a family from Fars itself, from the very home province, from villages in sight of Persepolis, who rose in the 3rd century of the Common Era proclaiming, in so many words, the Restoration, King of Kings of Iran, worshipper of Mazda, heir of the ancients. And under the Sasanian kings the old civilization had a second high summer 400 years long, the fire temples endowed, and the Avesta gathered and written down at last. A court of such ceremonial splendour that Rome and Byzantium copied its fashions, its diadems and thrones and silks, the game of kings itself arriving in this era, chess. Come up the roads from India and refined at the Persian court, and passed on to the world with Persian words attached. So that when a modern player says checkmate, in any language they are saying Shah Mat, the king is helpless. An accidental Persian lesson hiding in every chess set on earth, and it was this Persia, not the ancient one, that finally did what the Achaemenids never quite did. Its armies in one tremendous early 7th century war took Syria and Egypt and Jerusalem and stood across the water from Constantinople itself. The old empire of Cyrus reassembled almost to the man, for one generation, and then the last war of antiquity, Persia against Byzantium, 26 years of mutual ruin, left both giants bled white on their thrones, and out of the deserts to the south. In the same decade came the armies of a new faith, Islam, and the exhausted Sasanian state, the Second Persian Empire, fell to them in a handful of battles, and the last king of kings, Yazdegerd III, fled east along the very roads Darius III had fled along 1,000 years before, and, in a symmetry that history had no need to arrange so perfectly, but did, was murdered near Merv by his own people in the year 651 of the Common Era, and this time the fire temples mostly went out, and the story of ancient Persia, the whole 1100-year story from Cyrus to Yazdegerd, was over. Except, once more, and finally, it was not, and the manner in which it was not is one of the loveliest facts in the history of civilizations. The conquered land became Muslim over centuries, but it did not become Arab. Alone among all the ancient lands the conquest swept, from Spain to Central Asia, Persia kept its language, and after 2 quiet centuries the Persian tongue rose again, written now in Arabic letters but Persian to its bones. The same language whose oldest form Darius carved at Behistun, and it rose not as a survival but as poetry, one of the supreme poetries of the human race. Ferdowsi around the year 1000 gathering the old legends into the Book of Kings, so that, as he wrote, having brought the dead to life, I shall not die. And after him Omar Khayyam with his astronomy and his wine cups, and Rumi, whose verses are read tonight in more languages than perhaps any poet alive or dead, and Saadi, whose lines on the sons of Adam being limbs of one body are woven into the carpet at the entrance of the United Nations, and Hafez of Shiraz, whose book of poems sits tonight beside the holy book itself in millions of Iranian homes, and is opened at random by families on winter solstice night to tell fortunes, a domestic oracle of pure poetry, in a city a morning's drive from the tomb of Cyrus. The gardens survived too, and conquered their conquerors, the fourfold walled garden with its crossed water channels, becoming the very image of heaven in the new faith, copied westward across North Africa into Spain to the courts of the Alhambra, copied eastward into India to wrap the Taj Mahal, which stands in a Persian garden, built by a dynasty whose court language was Persian. And the paradise of the Persian kings billowed outward into the world's imagination until the word landed, softly, in every language of Europe, and in this one, and in this sentence, and on your pillow. And the old story fed the new world through one more channel, the strangest of all, the Greeks. Because the little people at the Western Rim who fought the empire and wrote about it could never afterwards stop writing about it, Herodotus inventing history itself, the word and the thing, with Persia as the enormous subject that demanded the invention. Xenophon writing The Education of Cyrus as the mirror of ideal kingship, a book Julius Caesar read, and Thomas Jefferson owned in 2 copies, so that a fictionalized Persian shepherd king stood quietly in the library at Monticello while a republic was being imagined. And when the founders of that republic argued about how a large free federation might hold together, the examples in their schoolbooks of empire done wisely, tolerance, federation, roads, the post, were Persian examples wearing Greek dress, and the eagle on the standard of Cyrus, if the old accounts speak true, flew down the centuries onto more flags than one. Even the humblest machinery came through. The relay post of the king's eyes and ears became the model, via those Greek schoolbooks, for postal systems in empires that never heard the word satrap, and the motto over the post office doors of New York, neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night, is Herodotus describing Persian riders, which means that every letter carrier in America walks, whether they know it or not, under a Persian blessing, and our rider from the top of the night has been riding all this time. Much further than Susa. There is one last chapter, and it is the one this channel loves best, the chapter in which the buried world comes back. Because for 1,000 years and more, while all of that poetry was being written, the actual places of our story lay silent, and their very names came loose from them. Persepolis stood ruined on its terrace, and the people of Fars, no longer remembering Jamshid the mythical king from the actual builders, called it the throne of Jamshid, Takhti Jamshid, which is its name in Iran to this day, and travellers from Europe began to reach it in the 1600s, and stood baffled among the double bulls, guessing it had been anything and everything, and on the stones they found, everywhere. That neat, mysterious wedge-shaped writing, and could not read one word of it, nor could anyone alive on earth, because cuneiform, the writing system of the first 3,000 years of civilization, was by then perfectly, totally dead, the sound of every sign forgotten, so that humanity had, in effect, misplaced the first half of its own memory, all of Sumer, all of Babylon, all of Assyria, all of ancient Persia, entire libraries lying unreadable in the ground, the longest amnesia in the history of our species. The cure for that amnesia began, and you were promised we would return here, at Behistun, at the great cliff of Darius, because the king's threefold vanity, the same royal proclamation carved in 3 scripts for 3 languages, was precisely the key that code-breaking requires, one known text in parallel versions, and in the 1830s and 40s an English officer of the East India. Company stationed in Persia, Henry Rawlinson, a superb horseman and a better linguist, spent his leaves being lowered on ropes and propped on ladders 100 metres up that rock face, perched on a ledge scarcely wider than his boots, copying, sign by sign, thousands of lines of Darius's inscription. At one point sending a Kurdish shepherd boy swinging on a rope harness across a stretch of blank. Cliff no grown man could reach, to press wet paper moulds of the highest lines, and down in his quarters, year after year, Rawlinson and a small scattered brotherhood of scholars across Europe pried the old Persian script open, named by royal name, Darius, Xerxes, Ahura Mazda, sound by sound, and then used the Persian to unlock the Elamite beside it, and then the Babylonian beside that. And the Babylonian version was the master key to everything, because its script was the common script of all Mesopotamian civilization, and in 1857 the Royal Asiatic Society in London ran the famous test, sending one newly discovered Assyrian inscription separately to 4 scholars, Rawlinson among them, who translated it in isolation. And when the 4 sealed translations were opened together and found to agree, it was official. The dead writing was alive again, and the door of the deep past swung open on its hinges of clay, and through it, in the following century, walked everything. The flood story older than the Bible, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the laws of Hammurabi, the astronomical diaries, the whole buried library of the first civilizations, and among all the rest, in 1879, out of the ruins of Babylon, a broken barrel of baked clay covered in that same Babylonian script, which when Reed said, "I am Cyrus, king of the world," and told of the taking of the city without battle and the sending home of the exiled peoples, the Cyrus cylinder. The very voice of the first chapter of our story, silent for 2,400 years, speaking again, and it speaks tonight from its case in the British Museum, and a replica of it stands at the United Nations headquarters in New York, presented as a symbol of the ancient roots of the very idea of tolerance between peoples, whatever the historians correctly caution about anachronism. And the fact remains that of all the royal proclamations of the ancient East, the boasts and the flayings and the pyramids of skulls, the one humanity chose to set up in its House of Nations was the one about letting the captives go home. And the spades kept coming, into our own lifetime, the Oriental Institute of Chicago excavating the Persepolis Terrace in the 1930s and finding the archive of tablets under the ash, so that the 4 women and the rationed mothers and the couriers walked back into history 2,500 years after their wages were filed, and French expeditions at Susa turning up the great glazed brick arches of the Palace Guard, life-sized, stepping calmly along their walls in yellow and blue and white, now pacing the halls of the Louvre, and the little tomb at Passar Gaudet standing all the while in its plain on its steps, never lost, never really forgotten, locally called for centuries the tomb of the Mother of Solomon, which almost certainly saved it, a case of mistaken identity acting as a bodyguard, and in 1971 the modern nation of Iran held at Persepolis. Amid tents of silk, a festival for what it called the 2,500th anniversary of the monarchy of Cyrus, kings and presidents dining beside the ruins, and history, which has a sense of humour drier than any desert, arranged that within 8 years that monarchy too was gone, and the ruins remained, as ruins do, having outlasted now, by actual count, every single form of government invented since they were built, which they observe, one imagines, without comment. So let us end where the empire itself would have wanted the audit to end, with the ledger of what remains, and it is a long ledger. There is a country of about 90 million people called Iran, whose name is the same name those wandering herdsmen called themselves 3,000 years ago, speaking a language directly descended from the one Darius carved into the mountain, keeping a New Year festival, Nowruz, this very spring and every spring, that the carved processions of Persepolis were probably already keeping, on the same equinox, with the same green sprouting grain on the table, one of the oldest continuously celebrated festivals of the human race, now marked by some 300 million people from the Balkans to Western China, and recognised by the United Nations with its own day, the 21st of March. The empire's spring holiday having quietly outlived the empire by 23 centuries and gone on spreading, there are the Qanats, still watering the plateau, protected now as World Heritage, the oldest of them older than every government on earth. There are the words, riding in every ordinary sentence, paradise from the king's walled garden, magic from the magi, the Median priests, bazaar and caravan and taffeta, and khaki and lemon and orange and spinach and sugar candy, which came west along Persian roads with Persian names, checkmate from Sharmat, and the very word peach, which is simply persica, the Persian fruit, so that a summer peach is a small sweet monument, and there is the star Aldebaran, and there are the tulips, whose name is the Persian word for turban, carried to Holland from Persian gardens, so that the whole Dutch spring, if you trace it home, blooms out of Iran. And there is the idea, the big one, the one Cyrus minted and Darius engineered, and the cylinder still testifies to, that an enormous state can hold 100 peoples without erasing them, that difference can be administered with patience instead of terror, that the shepherd owes the flock a roof, an idea that every empire since has honoured at least in the breach, and that every federation, league, union and charter of nations since has been, knowingly or not, another draft of and ideas of that size do not die when their empires do. They just change vehicles, the way the letter changes riders at the fire and goes on down the road through the dark. And so we come back, at the very end of the night, to the high plain of Pasar Gede, because there is no better place on earth to say goodnight to this story. It is evening there now, in our imagining, as it was evening on the road when we began. The tour buses, if there were any that day, have gone. The plain is empty and enormous, ringed by the same mountains, and the dry grass moves in long, slow waves under a wind that has come down from the Zagros exactly as it did when the tents of Cyrus stood here. And in the middle of the plain, small under the huge violet sky, stands the little stone house on its 6 stone steps, plain as bread, 4 square, gable-roofed. The oldest royal tomb of its kind in the world, 25.5 centuries old, and empty now, of course, long empty, of everything except the one thing that was always really kept there, which is the name. I am Cyrus, who founded the empire of the Persians. Do not grudge me this little earth. Stand there a moment, in the wind, in the failing light, and let the whole of tonight's journey settle into its place, the herdsmen drifting down onto the plateau with their horses, the water sliding through the dark tunnels under the desert, the young king riding out from these very valleys to take the world with mercy as his weapon, the letter crossing the empire through the relay fires, the nations walking up the stairway in stone, hand in hand with their ushers, the ice in the desert and the gardens in the dust, the bridges of boats, the weeping king on the white throne, the glow of Persepolis burning reflected in the doorways of the villages, the old Queen Mother turning her face to the wall, the poets gathering the broken pieces and setting them in verse so that they could never be lost again. The officer on his ladder 100 metres up the cliff, copying, sign by sign, the voice of a king back into the memory of mankind, and the clay cylinder in its glass case tonight, lit softly. In a museum in a city on an island the empire never reached, saying to anyone who leans close enough, I let them go home. Once there was, and once there was not. That is how the grandmothers of Shiraz still begin, and it is the truest sentence in the world. Once there was an empire of all the nations of the earth, and once there was not, and both of those have finished happening, and none of it needs anything from you now. Not remembering, not understanding, not even wonder. The story is complete whether anyone holds it or not, the way the mountains around that plain are complete, and you can set the whole of it down now, gently, the way you would set down a heavy and beautiful book on the nightstand still warm from your hands, and let the plain go dark, and let the wind have the grass, and the stars come out over the little stone house one by one, unhurried, the way stars do. The same stars the night riders steered by. Because history does not really disappear, it just becomes the ground beneath our feet, the words in our mouths, the peach and the tulip and the paradise, the ground floor of the enormous old house we are all asleep in together. Are you still awake? If you are, that is perfectly all right. Some nights the mind takes the long road home, past one more relay fire, and if you would like company for the last miles, there is another long story waiting for you on the screen, another night journey through another vanished world, and it will be there whenever you want it, tonight or some other night. There is no hurry at all, none, and if these journeys are becoming part of your nights, it truly does help if you press the like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here together in the dark. And do leave your location and your local time down in the comments, that quiet, lovely roll call of the sleepless, Melbourne at 2 a.m, Ohio at midnight, Glasgow in the grey first light, all of us scattered across the turning world like the relay stations along one enormous road, each keeping our small fire, each passing the story along. But all of that can wait for morning. Nothing more is asked of you tonight. Nothing at all. So let the lamp grow dim now. Let the screen grow dark whenever it wishes. Let your breathing find its own slow pace, the breath coming in cool and going out warm, like a door swinging gently on a quiet hinge. And let your shoulders sink down into the bed, heavy and done, and your hands lie open and still. And let the day itself, whatever kind of day it was, be over now, fully over, filed away like a tablet in the archive, counted and sealed and safe, nothing owed on it, nothing left to pay. Let the road grow long and soft in front of you, and give the letter to the next rider. You have carried it far enough, you have done your stage, the fire is warm, the horses are stabled, the stars are out over the plateau, and the water is running quietly in the dark underneath everything, mile after mile, cool and patient and sure, carrying the snow of old mountains down to gardens you will never see. And that is enough. That has always been enough. Let your thoughts loosen now, and drift, like smoke leaning out over an evening valley, like the last dust of a caravan settling on the road, very slowly, very slowly, very slowly, and let go gently of the kings and the gardens and the long pale road, of the day and the night and the waking world, and sink down, softly, easily, without any effort at all, into the deep and quiet dark, into rest, into sleep. Close your eyes. The story will keep. Good night and sweet dreams.